since we're a small group, and some of you know each other and some of you don't, is maybe introduce yourself and a little bit about what you do, and that way we can kind of get to know each other, and also I'll try to gear the training toward the kinds of things you specifically do. Go ahead.
Oh, you want me to go first? You can go first.
I can go first.
You can go first.
Yeah, I'm Maureen Bryant, and I'm an attorney, and I do mostly family law and a lot of minors counsel, and have done many trials with children that have been abused sexually and otherwise, and most of them don't turn out too favorably. The courts are very, very far behind.
Very.
So it's very disheartening, but that's what I do.
All right.
My name's Michelle Hahn. I'm also an attorney. I do predominantly custody work. I've just left a very large firm and I'm working in a boutique firm now, and they do a lot of CPS related work, dependency. So I'm doing a lot more training in dependency, getting up to speed on that, and domestic violence.
Which county?
as well. Sacramento.
Okay. And you're in our county, right, Maureen?
No, I'm in Contra Costa County.
Right.
That's where she is.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah. I'm Allison. I have a private practice as a therapist, and just last October started doing custody work, evaluations, special master, parenting coordinator, recommending therapist. I think they think of names on the fly sometimes. Because it's all basically the same thing. Co-parent, recommending co-parent, so in Alameda and Contra Costa County.
My name is Brandon McMillan, and I'm what they call the MFGI, with the I, and waiting to take my exam.
Oh, bless your heart.
So all the 3,000 hours and all that has been completed. And I'm sitting there.
Congratulations.
Yeah, congratulations. That's a
Yeah.
arduous
It's tough.
task.
And I'm very interested in custody work as a therapist, and so that's why primarily the reason why I'm here. In addition, I do some work out at San Quentin, as well as options, as well as with a private, well, not a private counseling service, but a counseling service. And so I'm just busy and studying for the exam.
Good. When do you get to take it?
I don't know, you just wait until they send it.
Oh, so you're new.
Oh,
They'll send you a letter.
Okay.
Okay, but
Yeah.
it takes about 8.
They're backed
six-
up.
6 days.
Yeah.
6 to 8 months, isn't that after you're done? That really changed.
It never used
That's
to be
crazy.
like that.
Yeah,
that's
The
ridiculous.
budget cuts helped that
Right, they got
because,
hit with that.
yeah,
They brought on a
They're-
couple of new people, but it's.
it's disheartening, isn't it? But it gives you time to study,
Yeah, and that's what
so
I'm doing.
Well, that's true.
use that time wisely, because
I
if you don't pass, you gotta wait 6 months.
Oh, okay, well, that's what I'm doing.
So,
He's passing.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
and I spent all the money, the Grossman thing.
that, you know what, and it's exactly what the test is, so you'll be fine. Once you get up to 70%, when you're studying, okay, you're fine.
Okay,
All right, this
It
sounds like a
mimics it.
person of experience.
It mimics it,
okay,
so.
good. Somebody told me that he overdoes it, and there's some place in Berkeley that hits it right on time,
No,
but.
no, Grossman's got it down,
Okay, good,
yeah.
okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right.
My name's Lori Salinas, and I'm a licensed marriage family therapist, like Allison. I also have a master's in science and criminal justice. I work with family law in so many different capacities, whether it be 730 expert, co-parenting, the child's therapist. Let's see what else. That's just one aspect of my practice. I have a private practice. I own the Crockett Counseling Center, and we run the 52-week Batters program for both perpetrators,
Oh,
both genders. I am one of the companies, I think there's 10, that is under the umbrella of probation. So they govern our program, and they can audit us at any time.
right.
Zero Tolerance for Domestic Violence in Contra Costa County has now joined in a committee to oversee our program to make it top-notch for Contra Costa County DV court, family court, criminal court. I also treat primarily victims of crime, child molestation, sexual assault, rape, child sexual assault, rape, and homicide. So
All the fun stuff.
All the fun stuff.
Yeah, hey. I am Linda Bernard. I am MFT in private practice. I've been in private practice since, gosh, in California since 1981, I think. It's good that people in here, most of the time I do this training, everybody's really young, and they weren't even born by the time I got my degrees. And it's like, okay, if you weren't born by the time I got my doctorate, then I don't know what we can possibly talk about. But anyway, I'm in private practice and I do a lot of court work. I do a lot of expert witness testimony in domestic violence, rape, and trauma cases. It's probably 50% at least of what I do. And so I spend a lot of time in jails as a visitor. A lot of time in jails interviewing people. A lot of what I do are battered women who kill their abuser, and so I work on those kind of cases and testify as an expert. But I also do, any kind of case where domestic violence is involved in the case in any way. Recently, I'm doing several cases of young men who have committed homicides, who had a long history of domestic violence, and either killed someone who was their perpetrator, like his father or stepfather, or a bullying kind of situation, or those sorts of things. So, like I say, it's interesting, never a dull moment. So that's what I do.
I do expert witness work too, I forgot to tell you.
Oh, yeah, right.
Mostly for child custody cases under the umbrella of battered women syndrome.
Right, so you do the juvenile dependency cases mostly?
Sometimes. I'm not a big CFS fan, so and they know it, so that's difficult.
Okay, so yeah, that's
But at the same time, I don't like how their court systems run. But at the same time, for high conflict, domestic violence custody cases outside of CFS, that's where I perform better, I feel. 'Cause you're not shackled and chained like you are in CFS court.
Okay, so I like to do things where we interact with each other. And when I do things in great big groups, I always just tell people I don't mind being interrupted. Because I put all this stuff together, but I'd really rather talk about what you want to know. So even though we have an agenda, I'm pretty much famous for never getting through the materials that I put together. Although last year I think we speeded up and
Pretty
got through.
close.
I think last year we broke that record.
Yeah.
I believe we did. Usually I'm lucky if I get halfway through. But I tried to put a lot of stuff together so you have a lot of information. And because we weren't set up to do a PowerPoint, you just get it and hand out this way.
Thank you.
But ask any kind of questions that you want anywhere along the way so that I can kind of tailor this a little bit toward what you're interested in, what concerns you most, what you think impacts you the most, that sort of thing. So we don't have to stick strictly to my agenda here.
I have one quick question. How does
Yes.
one become an expert in the court, managing the court's environment? Quote unquote. How does one become an expert?
Well, the old definition used to be travel 50 miles and you're an expert, because anybody that's from away from where you are is an expert. It's interesting because the answer to your question sort of depends on what arena you want to work in. If you want to work as a child custody evaluator and do testimony there, you do all this kind of training and get this expertise and background, and you have to do the bigger training of the 16 hours and all that stuff. If you want to work in the juvenile dependency courts, then there's a process that you go through to get trained and to get certified by the juvenile dependency courts. If you want to do what I do, which is I testify all over Northern California, testified in lots of other states. Mostly it's a matter of having the background and the experience. What the law says is you have to have the experience and the training and the background, and then if you can qualify based on examination and cross-examination as an expert, then you become one.
It's up to the judge too. So for example, when
Right.
you were, let's just say you were hired, they still go through your credentials in open court and then they decide whether or not they're going to accept you as an expert witness, and that's generally how it works.
Okay.
Like she said, if you're licensed in your field, then you can consider yourself an expert.
To do like what I do, you have to have some specific expertise in domestic violence or rape or those kind of things, because you have to be able to, you have to be sanctioned by the court, by the judge, obviously, each time that you go in. I mean, it's not a sure thing anytime you go in, because every time they have to accept you as an expert, every time you go in court. but I've testified like 375 times. I don't think I've ever not been qualified as an expert when they've offered me, and I can't imagine that I ever would be now, given all the experience that I have. If I tried to do something that was out of my area of expertise, like drugs and alcohol, then they should not qualify me as an expert, because I'm not an expert in drugs and alcohol. So what you need is to know your field and be an expert in that field, be recognized, be able to answer the questions that anyone would answer you, to show that you have that expertise. And an attorney offers you, the opposing counsel can ask you questions, and then they offer you up to the judge, and then the judge makes that decision. And then ultimately, if it's a jury trial, the jury decides whether you know what you're talking about or don't know
That's
what you're
true.
talking about. Because the jury's instructed that they can ignore you if they want to ignore you, that to take what you're saying not as evidence in the case, but as opinion, and they can use that opinion with whatever weight they choose to use it. So they can choose to totally ignore you, or it can have a big impact, or sometimes you never know. So it depends on what court you want to work in, what you have to do.
Sounds good, thank you.
Okay. Look at the materials. I just put this stuff on the front here that just gives you my contact information. And I took a class on getting a book published, which is one of the things I'm working on doing. And one of the things I wanted to do for this class was I wanted to start a blog, and I'd never done a blog before. So my daughter-in-law, who knows about all these kinds of things, set me up with one, and she came up with the name. It was on the couch with Dr. Bernard.
Yeah, I just saw it.
So,
That's good.
So if you ever want to read it, it's mostly about domestic violence, and I try to keep it short.
Okay.
And, with all the stuff in the NFL right now, I've been making some comments about that, and I'll be adding some more stuff about that. But it's just kind of short and sweet, and I put something up there about once a week, and so if you want to follow it, you can. If you don't want to, you don't have to. But it's not as entertaining as I usually am. I don't think it's hard in a short blog to be funny. Although as I get used to it, I'll probably be able to do that better. But anyway, all my contact information is on there with my website, my email address, my mailing address, my phone number, all that kind of stuff. And if after the training you have any questions, the easiest way to get me is to email me. So just email me any kind of questions that you have. I put together just kind of a basic outline of what we're going to be doing today. And like I said, we seldom get through my outline, but all the materials are here anyway. So what I wanted to start with is, are all of you familiar with the ACE study? Have any of you heard of the ACE study? Have you heard of it? Anybody heard of it? Okay. It's kind of interesting because this is probably going to become the gold standard for how we look at what we're doing with children in domestic violence and the custody courts. And I think as time goes along, you are going to be asked to show that your decisions that you make as an evaluator or a recommending person of any kind, whether you're a guardian ad litem, whether you're a mediator, an evaluator, whatever you do that has to do with children and families, I think at some point the courts are going to start adopting more information about the ACE study, and you're going to have to show that what you have done is consistent with that information. So let me tell you what it is. What's ironic about it is this is published at first in 1998, so why don't any of us know about it? It was republished in 2004, I believe. The ACE study was a huge study that was done by Kaiser Hospital,
Yes.
where they looked at all the health issues of people who were members, and they did like 34,000 people that they gave this massive survey about their health. And actually, I was one of the people that was included in the second batch, which was interesting. I didn't even know it till I read the study's information. What they did were these massive interviews. I was interviewed on the telephone. I had to fill out all these papers, and I was interviewed for almost 2 hours on the telephone. They want to know everything about where you grew up, where you've lived, where you went to school, what kind of friends you had, what illnesses you had as a child, everything they could possibly find out about you, not just your medical stuff, but everything about you and your history that they could try to find out. And so they put together all this medical information to try to get profiles of people. And then what they did is they went back to all of these people and said, would you be willing to answer these few questions about adverse childhood experiences. That's what ACE stands for, adverse childhood experiences. Now, this was not a study that was trying to prove anything about child abuse. It was not a study that was trying to prove anything about domestic violence. It was a health study, which is what makes it kind of interesting.
So they're looking for correlations.
Right, so what they did was, and I'll go through with you what they did with these folks, but they took these people and they asked them these questions about adverse childhood experiences they'd had. And then they correlated, over a period of years, they correlated how many of these adverse experiences that a person had had in childhood and what their health profile looked like. And in a nutshell, what they found out is people who experienced adverse childhood experiences have more serious health problems and die younger than people who don't. So what we know now is we know definitively that if you are a victim of child abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, if you are a victim of domestic violence, if you witnessed domestic violence, whether you were yourself hit or hurt, that if you experienced those things and one of your parents was involved in substance abuse, someone in your home was in prison, that if you have those adverse childhood experiences, it actually impacts your longevity. And whether you get the chronic kind of illnesses that kill people. So one of the things that's going to be really impactful, I'm going to go through this more, but one of the things that's going to be very impactful for the work that we do in the family courts is, if we are putting children in homes with abusers, we're harming them. And we now have definitive research to show that we're killing those children, that we are making their life expectancy shorter. That if we do something that puts a child back with a child molester, or that puts a child in the primary home of someone who's committed domestic violence, that we are going to be instrumental in shortening that child's life.
That sounds lovely, and I think that I completely agree with you, but here's what we're running up against, is a family court system who dismisses this
Right.
by their overriding desire to have 50-50 custody at any cost. Because
Right.
their statistics supposedly shows that if you split the custody right down the middle, instead of giving one parent more physical custody than the other parent, that they seem to fare better. I don't know where they get their statistics or where they get their information.
Well, I know where they got their research.
But it's very frustrating because we will demonstrate, like you said, through psychological reports, through behavior modification, monitoring and documentation, present it to the court, and they're like, well, you know what, our goal is, thank you for your information, but
Right.
our goal is that, we want both parents to be in their life, and they just need to learn to get along. Well, that's just great, but that's,
we know
in a
that
perfect
doesn't
world,
happen.
we would love that, but when you're dealing with someone who's, like, let's say, super narcissistic and has sociopathic tendencies, which some of these psychological reports come out, they're submitted to the court, they're almost falling on deaf ears because, like you said in your statistics here, the violent perpetrator ends up with some sort of custody, and we're back to square one because their desire is 50-50.
What's going to happen and what's ultimately going to change that, and I know the research that that's based on, and the people who did the original research actually now say we were wrong.
Really?
Okay, but the family courts don't catch up. And one of the problems with family courts versus criminal courts is criminal courts have their behavior dictated by appellate cases. And those of you who are attorneys can correct me if I'm wrong about any of this. What they do is dictated by appellate
By
cases.
case law.
Okay, and there's a whole host of appellate cases that go up from the state appellate courts to the state Supreme Court, to the federal appellate courts, to the federal Supreme Court, and that dictates law. What happens in family courts is the family courts have hardly any appellate law because people can't afford to appeal family law
Right.
cases. If you're in a criminal case, it's automatically appealed and you get an attorney assigned. Doesn't matter whether you have money or not. You get an attorney assigned for you and your case gets appealed, and you can continue to get pro bono attorney support all the way through. In family court, in California at least, in New York it's different, but in California, if you can't afford an attorney, you're pro per, okay? You can't afford $50,000 to $75,000 to appeal your case.
You're so right.
And the appellate courts don't like family law cases, so even if they get one, they tend to either not take it, which they have the choice to do, to take it or not take it, or they just support the status quo, or they do almost nothing. That's starting to change in California, and that's what's going to change what you're talking about. Nothing in the family laws is going to change where we implement anything we know about current research until the appellate laws force them to change. So the biggest thing we have going right now is we have the Family Violence Appellate Project out of Berkeley. Okay, it's a nonprofit organization.
Is that Nancy's?
Nancy Lemon, if
Yeah.
any of you know Nancy Lemon, Nancy Lemon is one of the people who's one of the founders of it. Nancy Lemon is a professor at Berkeley, a law professor at Berkeley, who is one of the leading domestic violence experts in the country. Written the only book on domestic violence law that's used in law schools. She and several other law professors at Berkeley and some of their third-year students put this program together. They take cases pro bono. And what they do is if you have a case that has been finalized, the case has to be finalized, and you think something happened that should be appealed, you submit it to them, and they obviously are getting a lot of cases, so they're picking and choosing ones that they think they can really get some law changed. So they can't take every case.
Yeah, I agree. Wow.
So they're taking cases, they've already presented, I think, 7 cases to the appellate courts. They've gotten appellate law on 5 cases. They're trying, now they can't use them unless they're published.
Right.
So sometimes it's an unpublished case, but you can petition for the case to be published, and then once it's published, it becomes law that you can cite in your next case. So they've already got some appellate law on some restraining order cases, and what they're doing is they're gradually going to get appellate law on all of these issues that we're talking about.
We need to follow that.
And as this happens, judges do not like to be overturned by the appeals court. Okay, it makes them look bad. So as we get appellate law that forces family law judges to follow the law, we have the law. They just
But
won't
it's
follow.
discretionary. They use their own discretion
Yeah.
over what's already. Yeah, I
Well, they
agree.
just don't even follow Family Code 3044, might as well just be in
That's
the
right.
trash can, because they don't follow it.
That's true.
But if we get appellate law that says
They have to.
to do it, then they will have to do it. So that's what's going to change things like bringing in the adverse child study and some other research that we have. That's what's going to change what happens. It's not going to change because I go in and say it, because I've been doing it for 30 years and it hasn't changed anything. Okay, they hate me in family courts in Sacramento.
Gosh, yeah, I can imagine. I have a question. How do you feel, and I can't remember, maybe you know, they've got a new law pending where, I don't know if you guys have run up against this, I have till I want to pull my hair out. We get child custody evaluators who are biased, making their reports, and they're sealed. So when you catch them with something that's unethical or that is blatantly biased, we can't get copies of them to turn them into the Board of Psychology to let them know that this is an abuse of power.
That's one of the
That's-
things, that's one of the
that's
things
one-
I'm hoping
Yes.
that Family Violence Appellate Project
Thank you.
can
Okay.
take to the appellate court, because every county is different, and that's part of the problem in California, is every county is different, there's nothing uniform. So in Contra Costa County, you may do things one way, in Sacramento it's done another way. In Nevada County, I know for sure it's done a totally different way. If you get up to the northern counties, they don't even know what the heck they're doing. And in LA, it's done it a different way, so it's done, every county is different. And so we need some overriding law that says, first of all, they have to follow law, and we have to
Yeah.
get some decisions about these kind of things. There was just, and I meant to copy it for the training and I forgot to do it, there was just a case that came down where a psychologist was disciplined for doing a biased child custody evaluation for including parental alienation in an evaluation.
Sounds like one of
And
ours.
it's all the things that we're fighting about, but this person just got their license sanctioned. They got their license suspended with a stay for 5 years of probation. If I think of it during the break, somebody remind me and I will work my way upstairs and see if I can find a copy of it and get it printed out. If not, because I'm not sure exactly where it is, if not, remind me and I will send a copy of to everybody via email afterwards.
Okay.
Because it's really important,
Yeah.
because we need
It
to
is.
start, because if somebody doesn't, first of all, we've got to get the appellate courts to make decisions so that the judges have to follow the law. Second of all, we have to start sanctioning people in the child custody arena who do unethical behavior and sanctioning them through their license.
Agreed.
Because what tends to happen is they tend to dismiss it because it's a child custody case.
Mhm.
We either can't get the information because it's sealed,
Mhm.
or they don't do any sanctions because, oh, it's a child custody case, everybody's pissed off in a child custody case.
Mhm.
Why would we want to take a hold of that? Because nobody likes those.
Well, like you said, they skirt around the whole domestic violence thing. Have you noticed that some of these child custody evaluators, and I'm not picking on people, but I noticed that the two I'm talking about are men, not women.
Yeah, and I'm
And
going to be
they-
talking about that in a
Yeah,
minute.
yeah, and
Yeah.
they will not label the relationship as a domestic violence relationship. They will list all the behaviors of everything that's going on.
Okay.
But they won't go there. They won't label the relationship as a DV case. And then we get hired as an expert witness. That's either the mother's therapist or the child's therapist explaining that, hey, we need to label this correctly so that it's handled correctly so that we can use Family Code 3044. But they won't go there. And I've noticed that recently, that's how they kind of skirt around getting those things dismissed.
Well, they find all kinds of creative ways to get around it. I mean, they skirt, they don't call it that. Whoops. Hey, there's Susan.
Rolling out.
Okay. So I was answering the question about, yes, they skirt around it in every way they can so that they don't call it domestic violence, they don't call it child sexual abuse.
You're
They'll
right.
do everything around it. And the other thing is the little problem with 3044, one of the many problems with 3044, is it says there has to be a finding of domestic violence. But that finding has to be done by the court. So how do you get the court to make a finding of domestic violence? Oh, sorry.
Are you talking about like if there's no documentation of restraining order, incident reports, CIC interviews?
There can be all of that stuff, and if a judge does not say, I make a finding of domestic violence, then Family Code 3044 does not implement it.
And what they're doing is they're sloughing it off on the child custody evaluator who is also not labeling it.
Right, we've got all kinds of research
Right.
we've been going through about
Yeah,
that.
okay.
So the cases don't get labeled the way they're supposed to be labeled, but again, these things aren't going to change until we get some appellate law that changes it. Okay, so without that appellate law, and we're starting to get it, it's starting to filter through, you can get on the website for the Family Violence Appellate Project. It's whatever their initials are,
Yeah, I'd like to
.org.
write that down.
And
because
you can
just
get on
made
their
my whole
mailing
day.
list.
I didn't even know it existed. Thank you.
Pencil, is there lead in it?
Yeah, it looks like it.
You can get on their mailing list, you can get on their mailing list so you get updates of the appellate cases that they have put through, what the status of them is. If you have a good case that you think would make really good case law, have the person approach them with the case, and like I said, they can't take everything, but they're trying to pick the cases to make case law. And if they do that, then it's gonna help everybody.
Since you're also child sexual assault expert
I'm not actually.
in, well, you said you did child sexual assault
No, I
cases.
said I do sexual assault, adult sexual
Adult,
assault.
pardon me.
I have
Okay.
testified in child sexual assault cases, but I don't really consider myself that much of an expert.
Well, then let me ask you this.
Okay,
In the context of the child custody evaluator having anonymity through the sealing of those documents, do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay. There was a 3-year-old who was molested by her dad. He kept switching therapists so that the child wouldn't talk. She talked eventually, and it was founded. The CPS was already called. They put the case off for another year to make sure that the child got therapy. And sure enough, she finally told this therapist, third therapist that was involved. The therapist happened to be working with the child custody evaluator, letting him know that, hey, you know what, this did happen. No one recalled CPS to let them know that, yes, she is saying that this happened, okay?
okay.
Number one. Number two, when the child custody evaluator was told, he said, quote, it's not significant enough abuse for the child not to be with her father. They gave him 50% custody. So where is it that molestation is okay because it, well, you know, it wasn't that bad? Or is it just something that, is that discretionary now too? I mean, where's the laws for molestation?
Everything's discretionary in family court until we have some law, some appellate law that
But that's
says
an
it's not.
example
And
of-
that's another example.
Okay.
Is, you know, there's so many issues that have just been allowed in the family courts to be just loosey-goosey. And it's up to the judge, and unfortunately, the judges have turned all their power over, and was gonna talk about that when I talk about the Saunders study, but one of the things we know is that the judges abdicate their authority to the evaluator report instead of them keeping the power to make the decision. Because in the real world, somebody should submit a report, but the judge should look at that as only
facts.
one piece of information, and then the judge is supposed to weigh the evidence. What they do instead is they turn all that power over to the evaluators who have no training in how to collect evidence. They're not detectives, they don't know law, and so basically we've turned the law over to vigilante law, in my opinion, which is we've turned it over to a bunch of psychologists. And I'm a mental health person, but I don't personally think we should even be in the family courts. But be that as it may, they've given us way too much power. And when you give people power that they shouldn't have, they tend to exert way too much and abuse that power. So one of the things we've seen is that they just start making stuff up. It's just like with the child custody stuff. Well, what's okay molestation? I don't know. What's the definition of okay molestation? You know, in the criminal courts, there is no okay
Exactly.
molestation, but the family courts don't follow criminal court law. So until we get some appellate decisions that force judges to do things differently, they will do exactly what they're doing now, which is whatever they want. And they don't have to answer to anybody,
Yeah.
because until there's appellate law that says differently, they don't have to answer to anybody. Yeah.
Are appellate decisions by county also, or are
No,
they state? Or
Appellate decision is state.
state?
State or
Okay.
federal. And then you
Okay.
first,
Depends on which
they first
circuit.
appeal them to the appellate court. Don't we have like districts?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're district appellate courts by the way they make up districts. So if you appeal it to your district and/or you appeal it to the state Supreme Court, there are some cases that are going up to the federal level, but those are national cases that, like Richard Ducote had a case that he was doing was trying to get to the federal Supreme Court, but I don't think it's ever gotten there yet. But these cases are the state appellate courts.
Okay.
But there's an appellate decision, and once that's published, then it becomes law
For the state.
for that district, and then usually for
Right,
the
I
whole
have a
state.
case law under my name, so that's
Okay, I
exactly
see.
how it went. is-
So if a district appellate court here makes a decision,
Yeah.
you can cite that to any other district, and they usually tend to follow what's done in other districts. Just like in federal courts, like we're in the 9th district in the federal court, and they're known to be more liberal than some of the other ones, and so some of the other federal courts don't like what we decide. So they don't have to do what the 9th district court says if they're in like the 3rd district. But you can cite it if you live there and hope that then if it goes up to the Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court will act on that.
And federal can adopt, from what I understand, because that's what happened in our case, because it was an insurance company. But yeah, I mean, ours was in Ninth Circuit, but it actually was adopted nationwide because of the, how should I say, impact that it had on insurance companies.
Right, and so, yeah, there are a lot of cases that, filter out. But like I said, as we get some appellate law, some things will change. Until we get appellate law, these judges can do whatever they want.
And what's the name of that organization again, please?
Family Violence Appellate Project. FVAP.org. And they have all kinds of fundraisers because they're a nonprofit. They have all kinds of fundraisers. They just had a thing over in the Bay Area. There was a Battle of the Bands, and they raised, I don't know how many, tens of thousands of dollars. And then they had one in Southern California. So it's a really good organization to get on their mailing list, to find out what they're doing, to be supportive of their efforts and all those kinds of things.
Give them cases.
So I encourage you to do that. Okay, so back to the ACE study. This will have zero impact. I will be testifying about this, as I hope other people will, about the ACE study, but it won't make any difference until we get some appellate decisions that say that the courts have to look at the impact of the decisions that you make, because it's in your instructions in state law that you have to support your decisions with with science that supports it, but no one does. Okay, but as somebody appeals that and wins that appeal, then you'll have to do that. Then all evaluators will have to do that, which will be good. Because let's quickly look at some stuff in this ACE study, okay? Some of the questions they asked, and just so you know, it's the psychological parts. This is all they asked of these people. It's yes or no, okay? Did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at, insult, or put you down? And you just answered yes or no. Did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often act in a way that made you afraid that you would be physically hurt? Yes or no? And then they go through the physical abuse. Did anybody ever push, grab, shove, or slap you? Leave marks where you were injured? And then they ask about sexual. And it's interesting the way they ask, did an adult or person at least 5 years older ever touch you in a sexual way? Ever have you touch their body? Did they attempt oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse? Did they actually have oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse? Did you live with someone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic? Somebody who was on street drugs? Was a household member depressed or mentally ill? Did somebody attempt suicide? Mother or stepmother pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had things thrown at her? Okay? Kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard? Repeatedly hit over a period of a few minutes? Threatened with it or hurt by a knife or a gun? And did anybody in your household go to prison? What we know is the more yes answers, the more likely that person is going to have one of the 10 identified illnesses that kill most people in the United States, and that your life expectancy is going to be shorter. Now that's scary for those of us who do a lot of work with child abuse and who do a lot of work in domestic violence. Because almost all the work that I do in my expert work is with domestic violence, rape, and trauma. So everybody that I work with who has children that are involved are being exposed to many of these issues. Almost all of the children that you are going to evaluate have been exposed to many of these things, because the 95% of cases that we never see are the ones where people make their own decisions, they get along, we don't get involved because there's no contested child custody case. It's those 5% of cases that we get involved in where there's domestic violence, allegations of sexual abuse, and other kinds of abuse. So this is what we do. The children we work with are being exposed to many of these factors that we now know through very solid research are harmful to those children and possibly even potentially down the road lethal. So as we are forced to, the appellate courts, force judges to look at more of these factors when they look at an evaluation. So when you do an evaluation, what we know from the Sanders study, which I'm going to be talking about next anyway, what we know from the Sanders study is that you can predict what an evaluator is going to recommend by knowing what they believe ahead of time.
Yep.
Okay? You can predict it. It's very easy to predict. We also know that more male evaluators tend to not believe domestic violence and child sexual abuse exists.
You're right.
And they more often don't advocate for supervised visits. Okay? But we also know that evaluators use any kind of assessment tool that helps to assess for domestic violence or child sexual abuse. They don't even know what the tools are, let alone use them.
You're right.
Okay, but yet it says in your mandate that when you make a recommendation, it has to be scientifically, it has to be evidence-based. We use that term now, everything has to be evidence-based. But nothing that evaluators are doing is evidence-based.
Just real quick on that, in that case that I was talking to you about assessments for DV.
Right.
And I put that in my report, and the attorney called me and said she had never, ever seen that in an evaluation report in 11 years.
Right.
Just reminded me of that.
Right, so what's going to happen is somebody is going to get an evaluation done that's going to be a bad evaluation where there's some documentation of domestic violence, exposure to domestic violence, and or child sexual abuse, and an evaluator is going to recommend that that child have 50-50 custody, which is what they try to always do, or that they end up doing the flip where they call the mother an alienator and give the child to the abusive parent. Somebody is going to take that to an appellate court at some point in time, and if they win that appellate judgment, then we're gonna have some appellate law that says that that report was based on nothing and it was harmful to the child. So once we get some appellate decisions that say that what you do and what your opinions are have to actually be based on something, then that's gonna change the field. That's gonna change the playing field dramatically. Getting that to happen is gonna be interesting, but it's gonna happen at some point, and when it does, it's gonna totally change the playing field. Using all this crap about alienation and Munchausen's and all the other stuff that they put in there to justify, taking children away from protective parents and giving them to the person who is the abuser is no longer gonna work. I have cases, and we all have cases all the time, where they start out where everybody realizes that there's one parent, and it's in the case that I'm thinking of, it's a father who is an abuser and a manipulator, has tried to abuse the court system, and the courts have, identified him as that, and he's been given supervised visits. Well, something happens where it starts flipping against the mother, and then this person ends up with custody. Well, we know these children are going to be harmed because we now have solid research data to show that. Okay? Now, somebody's going to appeal one of those cases, and it's going to be upheld, and then you're no longer going to be able to do those kind of things without some justification or without showing that you're doing something that's not harmful. Because now it's just willy-nilly, they do whatever they want. All they care about is 50-50, you can't keep a parent, or
No matter what they do.
no matter what they
It's
do.
ridiculous, and I think too, the new term, which I hope becomes standard, and I hope these lawyers get it, I hope these judges start getting it, because on this end, it's like, you're so frustrated
Right.
with trying to get the evidence out there, and they pick and choose how they're gonna implement it.
Right.
And I'm frustrated with that, and I'm frustrated with the allowing of the perpetrators using institutional grooming techniques
Right.
to single-handedly, one by one, get rid of the pediatrician, get rid of the mediator, get rid of, whatever they don't like is being said. They're being able to, well, let's get the kid's on their fourth therapist, because,
One of the things that I find interesting, and this has happened many times, is the child has a therapist that they trust and that they've disclosed to, and they've filed a CPS report. Okay, then the opposing parent goes in and says, I want that therapist thrown out because now they're biased against me.
that's right, that's what
And
happens
the
all
courts
day long.
do it. They take the
Yep.
child away from the trusted therapist and now put them with someone who's court ordered. And usually, I'm sorry, but there's a cronyism system that
Yep,
exists.
that's right.
And they almost always put them with a therapist who believes in alienation,
Yep,
who doesn't believe the child was
or
abused.
stays neutral.
And so then
Won't make
the
a
child
decision.
ends up with a therapist who doesn't believe them. Okay, now, again, all of these things are gonna be allowed to continue to happen until somebody tells the family courts they can't do it anymore. They're gonna have to get slapped down a few times, and this is gonna take time. I've been working in this field for 30 years. Many of you have been working in this field for as long as I have. It's very frustrating. It's discouraging, it's disheartening. I work with kids all the time who are in these situations. I work with adults who are now adults who were put in those situations, and we're now seeing the effects of that on them and what's going on with their lives. And many of those kids are coming forward. If you haven't ever been on the Courageous Kids network online, go and just put in Google Courageous Kids, and you'll see a bunch of kids who are now adults who were put in the custody of perpetrators who are now telling their stories. One of the interesting things about that is the first time the Courageous Kids group ever spoke, they spoke at an IVAC conference, and there were 7 kids that were up there on this panel. And as I started hearing their stories, I started thinking, wait a minute, I worked on that kid's mother's case. Out of the kids that were up there, 5 of the 7 kids, I had worked on cases for their mother, and of course they threw out, because they don't believe anything we say, they threw it all out. And these kids are up there now talking about how they were put in the custody of the abusive parent and what that was like for them and all that sort of stuff. So if you've never seen that, it's really,
Okay.
it's very eye-opening, and it's also heartbreaking because we've harmed a bunch of children, and saying what we're doing is in the best interest of the child has actually harmed a lot of kids. So anyway, I always digress to a bunch of stuff. Yes.
Just a quick question, for those of us that are not therapists, what are some of the diagnostic tools that you would use to assess domestic violence?
Some of the what?
Some of the diagnostic tools that you would use?
Well, we have, and I can put together a list for you, but I also included one of the tools to use. Mostly what we have is, it's not so much diagnostic stuff as it is instruments
Psychosocial
and
history.
tools that we have to identify behaviors. Because one of the things I put in here, there's a couple of things I put in here that we've gone through, is a way to go through and assess all the behaviors to assess for domestic violence. Because one of the things people don't do is anything to assess it. They hear the person talk, they hear one person say, well, yeah, all these things happen, and they hear the other person deny it. So they turn it into a he said, she said. Well, there are tools to use to start breaking that down. There are no definitive tests, like a psychological test, that you can give somebody that shows who's an abuser and who's not. So doing MMPIs and MCMIs and all that stuff that they do is worthless as far as all those things are concerned, because there's no test to do that. But we do have a lot of instruments to use to break down behaviors. And we have a lot of different ones, and I included a couple of them in here. If anybody wants a list of some of the other ones, I can get those for you. I taught one last year. I had one that I taught in the program last year. I'm looking at Allison because she was there. You know, and there are various tools that are out there that are recognized in the domestic violence community and the sexual assault community to assess for behaviors. Because what we know is that there are certain behaviors that are
Traits.
consistent with
Right.
a child having been a victim of sexual abuse. Now, does that definitively say 100%? No. But if it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, most likely a duck. Now, once in a while you're wrong about that, but most likely to be a duck. So we have tools to use to assess for behaviors, and that's what evaluators need to be doing. If there's an allegation of sexual abuse, you don't do an MMPI.
No.
That doesn't tell you anything. What you
MMPI
do,
itself is
what you
abusive.
do is there are diagnostic tools out there to assess
It's
for
pretty
characteristics of behaviors of people who are abusers, to assess for behaviors of children who are victims of abuse. You use those tools and then you put together a picture.
And you're right, and I think to answer your question, we do have our own, I'm sure, you know, you use your own discretion, but there's lethality assessments, there's perception assessments that help us figure out how these people really think, and then we couple that with personality traits, which gives you those behaviors that we're looking at, and then you can either give them behavior modification tools based on what you're looking at, or you can give them a label, like what she was saying. Is this person a potential abuser? Well, we just went through down the checklist of the 20 warning signs. And like she said, looks like a duck, walks like a duck, looks like this is, you know, a potential abuser. But as therapists, we have to be really careful, because as many assessments that we do, there's this fine line of whether or not we're supposed to diagnose anyone with anything if they're not considered our patient. So when you're a child custody evaluator, you're kind of caught in the middle of what you're supposed to label and what you're not. And I think what one of our problems is in the court systems is that there's too many child custody evaluators that are stepping into the arena, but they're not stepping in with both feet. They'll do half of what they're supposed to do, but they're so afraid of labeling and coming back with the repercussions from the opposing party that they just don't go there, which leads it going back to the judge to make a decision. And since it's ambiguous to him, it gets dismissed again.
Right, making a diagnosis.
Right.
Saying that a child has been abused is not a diagnosis. Saying that someone is a battered woman is not a diagnosis. It's a description. Saying that someone's a batterer is not a diagnosis. It's a description. It's a descriptions of behaviors, perceptions, beliefs. Okay? And that's what we're looking at. So I'm not diagnosing. I can't diagnose a batterer. There isn't any such thing. Okay? But I can tell you, and there are instruments to help us measure what those qualities and characteristics and behaviors are. And that's what we need to be doing instead of giving psychological tests.
She's right, you're
That
right.
tell us nothing, you know, in the long run. Because unless you're assessing for whether somebody has got some serious mental health issue, why would you give an MMPI?
Exactly, and you know what?
Why do it?
And also, I think to answer your question, in terms of a diagnosis, I heard you make a comment. We can give a DSM-4 diagnosis of intermittent explosive disorder.
If it's appropriate.
If it's appropriate. But does that mean that that person's an abuser? Do you see what I'm saying?
Oh,
So
yeah.
there is no diagnosis for an abuser,
Not even
but we
the
do have,
DSM-5,
yeah,
right.
exactly, but we do have personality traits that are indicative of an abuser. then we're even overstepping sometimes because they'll say, well, are you qualified to make that observation because that's not your patient, even though you're the child custody evaluator. So
But
that's,
you don't have to have, someone doesn't have to be your patient in order to make a diagnosis.
Right.
Susan, you do assessments all the time.
All the time.
You
And
probably
I
have done more
diagnoses.
assessments than anyone I know, and you're allowed to make a diagnosis based on an
Yeah.
assessment.
but then we'll get a letter from the Board of Behavioral Science because because the opposing party will say, literally, where does the court say that you had the authority to make this diagnosis and or assessment?
You get that,
And then we're getting in trouble because we're not
Okay.
supposed to go there.
except that the 730, if you look at the 730
That
code,
covers
it
us.
actually does allow you to do that.
Right.
It does allow you to do that.
And the thing
Speak
is-
to that, Susan.
The thing is, that I thankfully rarely have to evaluate somebody who's an abuser. I've managed to create a world for myself. But I'm seeing past victims and survivors all the time, and I do a lot of immigration work, which is a huge relief because I get so angry in family court that my hair doesn't stand up.
Yeah,
every
me
single time.
too.
And that's why I could never be an attorney, because in a week of law school, I'd be burning the building down because the law is so screwed up. And criminal courts are also extremely screwed up. So the way that what you're talking about here today impacts immigration court is that a state level court can make some pronouncement, and then everybody else in every other legal system accepts that pronouncement as a fact.
There you go. Yeah.
And it's so frustrating when, you know, I'm dealing with a lot of cases, but I have this woman who's right now in ICE detention up at Yuba County. She's not eating, she's not sleeping, and she tried in San Diego County to get help for her domestic violence situation. She did lots of bold things that most people who are in it don't have the oomph to do. She went to the courthouse and asked for help. She went to the fire department, she went to the police, and they all told her, believe it or not, in San Diego, they couldn't help her because she didn't speak English. And this was about 9 years ago. Her batterer is also a person who traffics drugs, guns, and people across the border. And just horrible. So what does she do? Finally, out of complete desperation, she decides to try to frame him for a crime so that somebody will come and do something about it.
Right.
So she sets a small fire in her kitchen garbage. She ties herself and her kids up. She tells them the story, right? And then she puts the fire out, and the smoke causes the fire department to come. They come. Well, the forensic fire people say, no, she set the fire, so she's arrested for child endangerment.
There you go.
As
I
well
mean,
she
this is
should have been.
the
That
story,
was
we've heard
poor
a
decision on
zillion
her
versions
part.
of the story. And she gets convicted and sent to state prison for 6 years. And when she gets out of Chowchilla, ICE grabs her and
Yeah, they
she's
want to
been-
deport her, exactly.
Yeah, and they want to deport her
And the
now.
kids are with the dad?
The kids are with the dad,
Yeah,
with the
Yeah,
dad.
that's what I figured.
Exactly.
And, and so, right now, I'm with, and because she's committed this horrible crime, she's not eligible for a bond to get out of federal detention. So they have to try to do a very weird thing that no one's ever heard of, which is to get ICE to parole her.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
I've never heard of this before, and most of the attorneys I work with. So if we could get her out, she could go back to live with her dad and her brothers, but then she has this long road to hoe with the family courts to get her, she hasn't seen her children in 9 years.
Yeah, by the time she
This
gets
is
to
a
family court, her
typical
children will be
case.
18 and it'll be a moot point because it'll be all over with.
But she's able to talk to her oldest one on the phone at school, and he tells her that this guy's beating them all the time.
Wow.
Mm.
And nobody's doing anything.
I file a
Yeah.
CPS report, but, you know,
Oh, it doesn't, yeah.
Exactly, we know where that's
Yeah,
gonna
don't
go.
even get me going on
Exactly.
CPS.
So,
so,
it
but
sounds
about the
hard.
assessment issue, what I do is I use Richard Tolman's PM, the perception of women's maltreatment inventory. And I have it translated into Spanish too, if anybody wants a copy of that. And so anytime there's any violence against women issue, because sometimes people are filing federal things for the VAWA, or sometimes for a U visa or whatever, I always include that in their language. And there is a version of the PMWI for children who grew up in those
Right.
families. So I'm seeing right now, in the last few weeks, I've seen 9 youth that crossed the border from Central America in the last year.
Oh, that's right.
That's just me,
Yeah.
9. And all of them were exposed to horrendous kinds of interpersonal violence.
Right.
So I'm using those instruments with them, and I'm sort of leading a trail, chopping down through the federal system, like that the judges, now the IJs, are saying, okay, we see this again and again from your reports, and so we're taking it seriously. But the lawyers in the family court, the judges in the family court, they're not being
circus.
trained in this
Right.
when they go get their CLEs and stuff like that, so.
And they don't take the class, they don't wanna take it.
Right, right. Although I think it should be mandatory.
I think it should be mandatory too. Allison, you
I
had
just
something?
had a question about assessment tools in general, because there's some out there that are kind of creepy. So getting accurate assessment tools, I think, I don't know if you can put them on your blog or what, some kind of idea, because when you just
I can make a
Google
list of
rent-
some of
okay,
them.
I would
Yeah.
appreciate it.
I would
There are some
appreciate that.
very
There's it is, and part of it depends on what it is you're assessing, because there's one that's assessing for maltreatment of women, that looks at all the areas of psychological and other
Right,
kinds of abuse.
isolation, control.
Looks at all of those. And so, you know, there are several different ones. There are many that are well respected. There are several that are very well respected, and then there's a bunch of crap. So if I had gotten my stuff together a little quicker than I did, and then I had the flu for the last 2 days, so sort of derailed. I was gonna put together a list of them for you. I can still do that, and I will do that for you after the training is over, so you have those. Because I have copies of most of them, or have nowhere to get most of them, because many of them are not protected, so you can get them online, or the people who wrote them want people to use them, so they don't make you pay for them. You
Right.
can just get them free.
Yeah.
We're gonna be going through some
I
stuff
like that
today.
list because I think that's what I've run up against as well. And I like the idea of being, I mean, we have to assess our perpetrators anyway when they're in my
Right.
class, so I can see if they're, you know, compatible with my group and if I'm safe.
Right.
But I'd like to have some for family court in the context of, you know, what are these men and women's perception about family violence? I mean, you wouldn't believe how many people come in and don't understand that the verbal and the emotional and the controlling and the financial abuse is
Is
domestic
abuse.
violence.
Right.
Well, he doesn't hit me.
Yeah, that's what part of was, that's what the Saunders study, there was the big study that was funded by the National Institute of Justice. I mean, some of his findings, I talked about this last year in the training, so each year I try to do something different because they keep copies of it, but I put a synopsis of it in here. But one of the things that they found is that people don't use the right tools, they don't know what the tools are that they should even be using, that most of the evaluators don't use anything to assess for domestic violence or child sexual abuse, even when it's come up as an issue. That what they believe influences their outcomes, we know that going in. You know, I could talk to, if you put me in a room of 50 child custody evaluators that I've never met before, and I've never tested this, but I believe it to be true, and if you gave me 10 minutes to talk with each one of them, at the end of that, I will tell you what kind of recommendations that they make in court, and I would bet that I would be right about 90% of the time. Just finding out what their belief system is. Okay,
I think
because
you're
we
so
have
right.
research to show, we have solid research to show that children do not lie about being victims of sexual abuse, and that mothers don't lie about the children being victims of sexual abuse.
Right.
We have solid research to show that, but the family courts, most evaluators believe that mothers and children lie to gain an advantage. Even though the research is totally against that, and if I go in and present the research, the judges pay no attention to it. And again, none of that's going to change until we get some
You're
stuff that
right.
gets overturned on appellate cases. But we have solid research that shows that mothers and children don't lie about child sexual abuse when they go into family court. About 50% of them are lying and overturn custody because of that. Now they're wrong, and it's based on nothing except their beliefs about alienation. And it started out with Richard Gardner, and they moved away from Richard Gardner because he's been so discredited. Now they just call it alienation, and they cite people like Kelly, and they cite you know, other kinds of studies that support that, or the alienated child, and you know, they've changed the terminology, but the reality is the same, is that we're taking children away from good parents who have done no abuse and giving them to abusers because we believe they're lying.
Right.
And that because they're lying, then they're not friendly parent to that other person, even though the friendly parent stuff is
Regardless of what
supposedly
the, ac-
poo-pooed.
their documented actions are of the actual abuser.
Exactly,
It
so they're
overrides
giving
it,
children
I know,
in
you're
the
right.
wrong direction.
Mhm.
Okay, I have to take a restroom break.
Okay.
Is anybody else ready for a break? There's food.
And we're gonna reunify, and the dad had 25150s, 2 domestic violence convictions.
Oh, but he's rehabilitated.
Exactly, and since the
He
grandmother
did
called
all those
CPS and said she was
processes.
concerned about the humping motion that the little girl was doing since she had her first overnight over there, they took the child from her because they said that there wasn't enough evidence and they thought she was being coached, and she gave them back to the
Exactly, that's
father.
what they do all the
Of
time,
course.
we all know that. Okay, we gotta move
We all
on. Go
have
ahead, you
trash
go ahead and go to the bathroom, I'm gonna quickly talk about,
Okay.
I'm gonna quickly talk about, because, we're already so far behind it.
Yeah.
I put a thing in here about the Quincy solution, and the reason I put it in here is because I think everybody needs to know about this. And you can go online and learn more about it, I put in kind of a synopsis. But if any of you know Barry Goldstein, he is an attorney out of New York.
I have the book.
Who is a champion for battered women and has been for many years.
Yep.
He got his license taken away because they decided he fights too strenuously for battered women, and so somebody made a complaint against him, and he got
Got disbarred.
got disbarred for a few years. I think he's got it back now. But the point is, Barry's a very good guy. He's written some books, some good books, and some other stuff, and he's now promoting this stuff about the Quincy solution. Is what we know is in Quincy, Massachusetts, they started this project and said, we are going to see if we can end domestic violence homicides in Quincy, Massachusetts if we implement a whole bunch of things. And what they said is, we are going to prosecute strenuously. We are going to take every restraining order seriously. We are going to create programs that support battered women and their children. And this is not to say that men can't be battered, but this is the way they put it together.
Generally speaking.
We're going to put programs together for battered women and their children that include counseling, safety. We're going to take all this stuff seriously. We are going to put GPS monitors on abusers who are on probation. If you violate probation, you go to jail. We're going to put teeth in this thing. We're going to make domestic violence serious, a serious issue. And what they found is that they reduced the domestic violence homicides in Quincy, Massachusetts to almost zero. The other thing they found out is they reduced domestic violence in its entirety by a huge amount. And so what happened then was Salem did a project that was similar, Salem, Massachusetts, and San Diego did a program that was similar. Now the one piece they haven't added is the family courts, and that's what Barry is advocating, is
That's right.
we can eliminate much of the domestic violence in this country if we take it seriously, and if we create all of the programs around it to support that seriousness, including not allowing abusers to perpetuate their abuse through the family courts, which is what we're doing now. Is if you're an abuser and you go to family court, you can use the family court to further that abuse and just have a field day with it. So if we eliminate that and implement all the things that are part of the Quincy solution, we can literally take domestic violence out of being one of the major crimes in this country. And it will save the country $500 billion. So nobody's going to do anything if it's not going to save money. Okay, politicians don't do anything that doesn't save money. They don't do it because they're
Because it's the right thing to
humanitarian.
do.
Yeah.
Exactly,
Because it's the same
or
money.
because they really care about women and children, even though they say they do. They're going to do it because it saves money. So if you want to know more about it, go online and read about the Quincy Project. And Barry's going to be writing a bunch of stuff about it. But the reality is, we can do something about domestic violence if we do something. What happens is, just like the Ray Rice case, in the NFL. When that case originally, it was a while back that he was arrested, back in February that he was arrested. Now, we saw what he did, is he cold-cocked her with his fist in that elevator. She was unconscious, he dragged her out, kicked her, pulled her, did all this kind of stuff. Now, and we know there was you know, whether she wants to say so or not, we know there's been all
The tip
sorts of
an
verbal
iceberg, right.
and other kinds of abuse. This wasn't the first, you don't do this on your first
Oh, no,
time.
this was the first time.
Okay, this
it
is
ever
practiced.
happened.
Yeah, this is a well-worn behavior, plus all the verbal abuse and emotional abuse and all the financial abuse.
If
all
she
the other
would
stuff that
benefit
goes
from
with it.
turning him in financially,
Okay.
she would be, but it's more beneficial for her to stay with him right now.
Well, maybe or maybe not, we don't know that. We're making a lot of decisions
It's
about her
fear.
that none of us really
There's
know,
a
because
lot
I've
of
never
fear.
met her and you've probably never met her, so I'm not gonna make assessments about her because I haven't met her. And that would be unethical of me to do, because I don't know what her stick is. I can tell you what frequently happens in these cases and how it's consistent with that, but I don't know whether that's true for her. What I do know is they took that case, and we saw how violent it was. They took that case and they reduced him to a misdemeanor and gave him better treatment. Okay, that was in February when it happened. Okay, now, it's just now becoming a big issue because it's now all over, TMZ put it all over the internet, and we all know about it. But his case has already been tried. He was found, it was reduced to a misdemeanor with better treatment. Now, just because it's an uproar, the DA can't now go back and retry it, that's double jeopardy.
Yeah.
So he got his misdemeanor, and he got a walk. Now, should a case that violent be a misdemeanor? And that's what the Quincy solution is saying. Treat a felony as a felony.
Well-
Stop minimizing domestic violence.
It's also not considered a violent crime,
domestic
did you know
violence.
that? So when they're doing 3 strikes,
Well, it's not a 3-strike violence.
It's not, it's, exactly, and
So if you're just looking at 3 strikes, but it depends on what they charge them with too. And part of it is learning to charge it differently.
Mm-hmm.
If you just charge everything as a domestic violence, I mean,
Instead of
some of this
corporal
stuff should be
punishment.
charged as attempted murder, some should be charged aggravated assault. There are a whole bunch of things they could charge it at that instead of a
Corporal punishment of
273.5.
spouse is a
The
felony.
attempted murder would be, he kicked her. I mean, God knows where he could have.
She hit her head.
Knocked her
Yeah.
head into the
I
rail
mean,
on the elevator,
you
that
have to
knocked her
express-
out.
And then her head hit twice. He picked her up
Yeah.
2 different times and her head
Yeah,
fell
he
down.
hit her
Yeah,
twice
it's
and her head hit the
foreseeable.
rail. So
It's-
that could be an attempted murder case.
Yeah.
And part of the Quincy solution says, charge a case for the way it ought to be charged. Because what happens so often is they either dismiss the cases, like we've got Ray McDonald over in San Francisco 49ers, who was arrested, but he still hasn't been charged, and he's in Santa Clara County, and he still has not been charged, which is why the 49ers are saying he can still play. But they haven't done anything because he hasn't been charged anything. We know that most of the time they drop the charges. Half the time they don't even charge them. So, you know, there's a lot of pressure right now in the Santa Clara County DA to see what they're gonna do with this. But he hasn't been charged with anything yet. And how long are they gonna dick around, pardon my
Well,
language on the
they
tape?
have-
How long are they gonna dick around until they actually get around to charging
They
him?
have
If it's
a
like
year,
most cases,
yeah.
it'll go months.
They have
Yeah.
a year to charge,
Right.
so they could wait till the very end of the year.
They-
And
Yeah, they
so-
could wait till,
They could wait till the
After the Super
quarter to
Bowl.
Right,
12.
exactly.
you know,
And
but-
they very well might,
and by then charge him with a misdemeanor.
Yeah.
Or drop it altogether because we don't know whether
But Doctor,
this-
I agree with you. I wrote a thesis on this alone, is the
Yeah.
sentencing guidelines need to be changed. They're antiquated for both child sexual assault, rape, and domestic violence.
But the
They're-
truth is, they're already there, they're already on the books, what we're doing is we're not charging.
But there's some that are so old that the offense does not, I mean, the
Yeah,
crime
they
does
need
not
to,
fit
they need to
the.
update some things.
Yes.
They need to update.
Right, thank you.
It's also
Yeah.
what the judge does with discretion, even if it's charged properly. I worked at San Quentin for 2 years and I was horrified, but one of them was that they have these 90-day observation sentences where they'll send, and almost all of them are DV cases.
Yeah.
Some of them are drunk driving.
Okay.
And they send them for 90-day op, we call it, and they come to San Quentin prison for 90 days. And during that
Yeah.
time, they're supposed to get a psych eval and an eval by their correctional counselor. And at the end of those 90 days, they go back to court, and then the judge takes these evaluations and decides whether they're gonna get probation or whether they're going to prison. That should just be eliminated.
Right.
It's a huge
Well, it should be
waste of
considered a
time.
violent crime. If
But
it's
it-
a felony DV, it should be considered a violent crime, and it's not
No.
right now.
the whole problem too, though, stems from the economic factor,
Right.
overcrowding. What do we
Right,
do?
and that was in
You
my
know, and I
thesis,
mean,
was the
it-
whole
it-
AB
yeah.
109 project, it was the sentencing guidelines, it was discretionary law, I mean, all of that, and it's antiquated, it's old, we need to fix that
Well,
as
there, I
well.
mean, there are a lot of things that need to be fixed. Today, we're just focusing on this piece. There are a lot of things that need to be fixed, and those that work in the criminal justice system, all of us that work in the courts know there's a lot of stuff that needs to be fixed.
The
You
only
know,
way
what
we
I'm-
can
what
do
I'm
it
trying
is
to
by,
focus- yeah.
by continuing to make the record and get it out there, so that the appeals can take place, so that we can
Right.
get it, and then the judges are mandated.
Yeah, because that's the only way it's gonna change.
Yeah, until you
That
get
is the
some,
only way it's gonna change.
until we
there's a
get some
appellate law.
rulings from the court that says this judge will do, just like the Elkins case. Until that took place, everything was done by declaration.
Mhm.
I mean,
Yeah.
and who do you think wrote the declaration? You know,
Right.
and unconstitutional as all get out, and it took a pro per to finally push it and get it to now where it's suddenly, you know, wonderful and it's the law, but that's what it's gonna take is,
Well,
Right.
because the judges do whatever they want without feeling that they have to be accountable for anything.
Yeah.
There's no
Agreed.
oversight for
Right.
them.
Because
Yeah.
there is no oversight for them, there's no way to get rid of them or to fire them, you
That's
know.
not necessarily true. You can petition to have your.
Oh, it isn't gonna happen.
It never-
Yeah,
that's
I've
why-
actually, we've done it twice in the last month, and there's,
I
there's,
think,
you
I
can't
just
have
wanna
a
say
petition.
something. I think that we all know what should happen. We
Yeah.
know how it should be
Yeah,
and
you're
what
right.
doesn't happen, but I'd really like to get back to,
Yeah, you're
okay,
right.
so.
Yeah, I think the important thing in terms of the training is make sure you document, make sure you have a rationale for what you do.
Right,
If there's science to back it up, cite the science.
okay.
If you're doing an assessment, actually assess something, use tools that are available to you to assess what you're assessing. So if you're assessing for domestic violence, use domestic violence assessment tools, okay? If you're assessing for a serious mental health problem, then you use a mental health assessment. If you're assessing for child sexual abuse, use the tools that are out there to help assess for child sexual abuse. Nothing's perfect, but the more that you use that has documented
You're right.
science,
and don't,
documented science, not junk science, because they're using junk science.
Yes, they are.
Documented science, then you make a good record, and then a good record can then be presented by a good attorney, and then it can be presented on an appeal, and then we'll get some of these changes that we need.
and what I was gonna say is don't assume that the judge knows. Because judges change every 2 years.
Right.
In
You're right.
family court.
You're right.
So don't assume
varies.
that the judge knows the law. You have to educate the law, and it seems like
That's where,
it's
that's
basic.
where Lundy Bancroft comes in. I don't know if you guys knew who he is, I know you do.
Yeah.
And that's his mission now, is to
You
educate
have
these
to.
judges, because that is the problem. And Barry Goldstein, by the way, if you guys wanna know, has nothing but case studies. It's a blue book about this thick, it's about
Yeah, right
150
upstairs.
bucks. And you can get it from, the Clinical Institute. And they do nothing but domestic violence and child abuse. And it's a great website, but that's where you
Yeah.
get the book.
Yeah, there are great resources out there. And if-
Fantastic.
And if, there are people doing good work, it's gonna take a combination of good evaluators with good attorneys, getting some good case law. And we're gradually doing it, okay, we're gradually doing it. But keep doing good work, and ultimately it's gonna make a difference. You know, we get frustrated, I get frustrated, I tell everybody I'm never doing another family law case. And then
I say that
and then- And then
I'm not taking that
and
case.
then Seth calls me with a big sob story
I
of
know.
one of his cases, and next thing I know, I'm testifying in family court
Here
again.
we are.
You know, and I'm doing the same crap again, so, you know.
Or doing another pro bono case because the principal
Because they
needs
don't have
to,
any money.
exactly.
As
You
a,
know,
as a
so-
tool to do what you just suggested, I have been collecting all the most latest peer-reviewed journal articles about all this stuff.
Good, will you share that?
And so, yes, so I
Okay.
will send everybody copies and, I'm keeping a running,
Fantastic.
a running list. And when I submit a report, I get the lawyer to submit those journal articles with my report as part of the case.
That is the best
And
way
then
to do
I
it.
write little, I put little footnotes in my report and I put the citations at the bottom.
You know, what's interesting about reports that I write is when I do domestic violence assessment, and I mostly do them for criminal cases. When I do a domestic violence assessment on a case, it looks like somebody's master's thesis, because I
that's
have
right.
sometimes 5 pages of bibliography.
Right.
Because I don't submit it as Linda Bernard says. Because
You shouldn't.
nobody gives a good
you're
goddamn
right.
what Linda Bernard says
Right.
except Linda Bernard, okay?
Well,
Well, maybe you do, Allison, but you're in my fan club. Okay, but for the most part, anything that I say, I can document it. And it amazes me, people who go testify in court who can't cite any research.
It's just
If
scary,
I am
isn't it?
asked on cross-examination by an attorney for anything that I say, any opinion that I give, any way that I get there, I can cite off the top of my head at least 3 citations for anything that I talk about. And I try to keep them current, and you're keeping yours current. And so you document. That's how you get things changed.
And with
Right.
that documentation attached to whatever she's written or presented and what she's talking about, that will be submitted to the Court of Appeals.
Right.
So
Right.
they will have it.
So that could be
Right.
attached to.
That can be
evaluation
attached to
reports,
the
right?
evaluation report,
Yeah.
and therefore
Exactly.
becomes part of
And
the
I find that
record.
that tends to really intimidate the opposing attorney.
It
does.
That's what you want.
Because part of it is that they know you know what you're doing, and you're not just up there flapping your gums.
Right.
Right.
Okay, we gotta move on
Okay.
now. Okay, I put a section in here, so anyway, the Quincy report, you can, if you wanna know more about that, go online, you can get some stuff, and
Okay.
Barry's writing a book about it right now. The next thing I put in here is the thing about abuser behavior, and lots of us know lots of stuff about abuser behavior, but I just put a couple things in here that I thought were kind of different than what we usually do. I just attended a webinar, on male peer support and violence against women. And one of the things that they talked about in there is that when you talk to men about why do you abuse, what do you get out of it, those sorts of things, what we find out is that the peer support that men get from each other enhances violence. And one of the reasons why there's more domestic violence in the projects is not because men in the projects are any more violent than men who
It's
live
the
in
groupthink.
Beverly Hills, okay? It's not a racial, it's not a socioeconomic, it's not any of those things. What they theorize is it's because those guys hang outside and talk to each other. They chat all the time, and so what they do is they enhance their status by talking about violence. And violence against women is accepted. And so as they enhance their status by talking about violence, there's more violence there. And it's like the report was something 19% in public housing as compared to the rest of the country that's about 1% in a year. And what he's talking about is during hunting season, there's more violence. And it's not because of hunting, it's because guys get together and talk. And when guys get together and talk, just like we know about fraternities, when they get together and do hazing, they do stuff that none of those young men would do on their own.
Right.
They do some horrible, and a lot of it's become sexual to other men as part of the hazing. And the same way the sports groups, that they sort of encourage each other and then they embolden each other. And what's happening is that male peer support is part of what's an underlying issue with domestic violence.
It's
And
also
gangs.
cultural too.
It's
Well,
the gang
absolutely.
thing, exactly,
And gangs.
Yeah.
exactly.
It is.
That's why we're seeing all this Central American surge, because of the Maras invading all of Central America, and what they do is in groups, they kidnap, they rape, they gang rape.
Well, it's culturally acceptable.
Well, it's also
Exactly.
the group think process,
But
which is a
it's more
phenomenon
than
all in
group think.
itself, so.
I mean, and we've known it since the days of Hitler.
That's right.
ISIS is doing the same thing. I
Right.
mean, look at they're recruiting, it reminds me of sort of Charles Manson, because
Yep.
I've done some work with a couple of the Manson girls, who are now like women who are older than I am, who were these nice college girls who grew up in these good families, who went to the, esteemed universities, and they end up murdering people and slicing them up and writing in the walls in blood. It's like that group think that gets you caught up, and of course there was drugs and other sorts of stuff involved. But it's like the gangs, but it's like guys get together, and if they're guys who get together and talk about violence, or, the old lady did this and I put her in her place, she thought I was gonna blah, 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 well, fuck her, she can't tell me what to do. It's that kind of stuff that enhances violence.
Well, also the cultural piece, like you said, there's the preconditioning from family to family. There's the indoctrinated thought processes from what those cultures, feel about women. And I'm sorry to say, but in the Hispanic culture,
It's acceptable.
it's not only acceptable, but you've got hazing with the males that if they don't, male on male.
Right.
And
many
within
times.
for power, over whatever they're doing to the girls and the females in the family. I mean, it goes that, I'm sure you know, because you work in immigration.
Machismo is a mental illness.
Yeah,
I always say that every
yeah,
time.
but
Women people.
but that's there as well.
And some of it has not actually been shown to be, I mean, we know that the stuff going on in Central America is about gangs and stuff like that, but it's not necessarily about their culture per se.
No.
Oh, it's
And
here
so we
though.
have to be careful about what's the difference between gang kind of stuff and culture stuff.
Right.
And so,
Absolutely.
and so you have to be
Yeah,
very
there's a total
careful and,
difference,
you know, if
yes.
you're citing that stuff, make sure you know your research and,
Right.
because part of what happens is you want to be very careful not to be culturally insensitive.
That's right.
Racist, and it's very easy to fall into some of those kind of statements that we don't really have research to back up.
Yeah, you don't
So
wanna
we have to be very
generalize
careful.
it.
opposing counsel's gonna seize it.
Exactly, and we're trained not even to go there actually. But the accurate account from your victim will say it in and of itself if you have her psychosocial history.
About the peer support, because I found it kind of interesting, and one of the things I found interesting about what they do in their batterer intervention program, it's called Peer Support and Violence Against Women at the top. If you look about almost to the bottom, one of the batterer intervention programs there uses what they call a batterer control log. And each week they have to fill out this log of stuff and bring it back in for discussion, and includes them talking about their actions, which help to look at their patterns of abusive tactics, and not just physical abuse. We all know that it's psychological abuse, verbal abuse, economic abuse, all the other things. Their intent, he has to say what it was he wanted when he did that action. Okay, what his belief was about that action, because we know part of changing domestic violence is changing that belief that you have a right to control someone else. Okay? What their justification was when they did it. Did they blame? Did they minimize? What did they do to justify their actions? Okay, and what effect it had? What did he get? And that's the model that they're using to change abuser behavior, which I find really effective.
Yes.
Because it looks at all of the issues that we're looking at when we're looking at abuser behavior. It looks at everything behind it, those perceptions, those beliefs, those what did you get, what did you think you were going to get, all those things that are so much more dynamic than just looking at as just the purely psychoeducational stuff. That has its place, but if we don't do something about changing these beliefs, perceptions, and behaviors, we're not going to change abuse.
You're right, but the other
Yeah.
point that they're forgetting in here, which I noticed seems to be happening everywhere, you know, and I hope that someday you guys will reach down and do some research and find that this is true. Those biological differences that between men and women and how we react to situations. And if they're not aware that that is true, whether how a female responds to something and how she carries something in her head, and how a male responds to something and how he carries something in their head, there's hormonal differences between these two species, and they need to be aware that there are ways to control those warning signs that are just biological. And that is not in some of these components, and I teach it every Thursday. And I'll tell you what, there's guys that will say, you know what, I do know when I'm starting to feel rage, but I don't know how to stop it. I have this problem of impulsivity.
But that's about changing behaviors, and
But
that's part of what we're
But
looking at, is
it
teaching people
needs to be
to
addressed.
recognize.
It-
Well, there's a lot of stuff we need to do. I'm not disagreeing with you, but you know.
Well, I'm sorry, but you know, it's not in here, and it needs to be incorporated with behavior modification tools if we're gonna help them understand.
Well, then you need to write the articles. Write
You
the
got your
article.
job.
You know, that's, you know.
I already incorporated in my program, I just assumed that it would be common sense.
Well, somebody told me a long time ago what's common sense is not commonsensical. So, okay. There was another study that was done through an abuser treatment program, and it's the Gender Violence Institute that did it out of Clearwater, Minnesota. It's actually cited at the bottom of it. They did a thing where they had all the guys in their batterer treatment programs write down, and they did this comprehensive list of what do you think the benefits are of violence? What are the benefits of domestic violence? And these guys didn't have a bit of trouble writing this list, and I saw it, and it was actual longhand form when I saw it in this training program. The guys actually wrote all the things, and then they compiled this list of what the abusers in their programs thought were the benefits of violence. And we do violence because we think there's a benefit to it. If there wasn't any benefit, if there was a serious consequence, we wouldn't do it. In societies that don't believe in violence, or violence being an answer, there's very low violence. In countries that don't believe that people go around committing lots of crimes and it's not an expectation, there isn't high crime. I mean, I was in the military and I was stationed in Germany, and this was back in the 70s, so things have probably changed. But I lived out in the German economy, or I lived, we call it the economy, out in the German community. And right in front of where I lived was a cigarette and candy machine on a post that had a glass front. And I lived there for 2 years, and never once did I see that glass broken. Never once did I see it jimmied open. Never once did I see it broken into. Because they just don't do it. It was not part of their culture.
Right.
Police officers there don't carry a gun.
Right.
Okay? They carry a thing that's pretty effective that they whip around you and snag you with. But I could, as long as I was not close to an American military base, I could walk my dog anywhere at 2 o'clock in the morning and feel absolutely safe. That no one was going to hurt me. The only time that changed was when I got close to the American military base. Then I better watch my ass.
Right.
Because then I'm going to be assaulted, raped, mugged, whatever. But they didn't have an expectation or a belief in violence, so the violence rate was very low. It's true in Scandinavian countries. In patriarchal societies, in some of the Native American, matriarchal societies, where land was passed from woman to woman, if a man committed domestic violence, he was shunned and kicked out. Do you know how much domestic violence they had? They didn't have any. You know, so part of it is what we believe is a benefit. So if there's no benefit, it doesn't happen. And I'm not going to go through all these, but I put it in here so you can look
This is
at it.
an amazing list.
Because it's pretty enlightening. to look at
It
some of
really
these.
is. I never thought of it this way, but who would ask that question?
Exactly. They thought to ask it, what's the benefit? And the guys jumped right on it. They didn't have a bit of coming up. This is a
Yeah, we're talking
It's like a
about this Thursday
motivational
night class.
interviewing
Yeah.
approach to that.
This is why I'm doing this, because this is what I want to get.
One of the benefits is she will look up to me and accept my decisions without an argument. He believes that to be true.
Or
I had a guy bring in the Bible and tell me, see, it says right here that she must obey me.
She tells me I'm great.
Yeah, I'm the breadwinner. Buy the toys I
beat the
want.
crap out of her.
And I'm so wonderful.
Lots of money stuff.
Exactly, lots of
Yeah.
stuff. Choose your battles and what it'll cost her. Proves you're superior. I can win all the arguments.
Yeah, get your way so you can go out.
Get her to admit it's her fault.
Oh, you're right, I did it.
You know,
That's
I mean,
crazy
all of
making.
these are things that we kind of all know. But the
Right.
fact that these guys sat and actually put this on a list,
I love it.
to me, is pretty enlightening.
It is.
So I would encourage you, we're not gonna take the time now,
I mean, it's
but I
not
would
funny,
encourage
but
you to read every one of these things,
have some
because it's really
good
what they believe. It's really
Yeah.
what they believe, and it's pretty frightening.
Yes.
Okay, next thing. I'm jumping around a bit here, I guess.
That's fine.
How's everybody doing? Are you doing all right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Almost.
How are you doing? Okay.
I'm doing good, well, as good as I ever do, but,
Okay.
you know. Okay, one of the things that we found out from the Saunders study is that most evaluators and mediators don't have a clue about post-separation intimate partner battery.
You're
That
right.
they don't know anything about it, they don't even believe it, they think, you know, everybody just says, she should leave, she should leave, she should leave. Nobody understands what happens that after she leaves, things are many times worse. More women are killed or seriously harmed
That's
within the
right.
3 months after losing their abuser than leaving their abuser than at any other time.
First 2 years actually.
Yeah, Lenny wrote a book about
It
it.
actually goes out 2 years
The
now.
level of
Bancroft wrote-
violence becomes much more lethal for the first 2
That's
years
right,
after the
exactly.
separation.
More
Right.
women are killed during that period of
Right.
time, and just because you leave doesn't mean there's no abuse. Abuse continues after you leave.
And can get worse.
The public believes that leaving is the answer. Every time you see something on TV about domestic violence, the question is, well, you know, when there's a homicide, well, why didn't she leave? Why didn't she get a
Well,
restraining
she
order?
knew.
She knows that leaving is dangerous,
Yes.
okay?
Yeah.
And sometimes she does leave, but she continues to be abused even after she leaves.
Well, and the court helps facilitate that,
Yeah.
And
unfortunately.
Yes,
the
they
one
do.
place that helps facilitate that's the family courts.
You're right.
What is the one place that makes you deal with your abuser? The family courts. They send you to mediation. What's the worst thing you should do when there's domestic violence? Is send somebody to mediation.
Co-parenting, family reunification.
Oh, I love those.
Yes,
I
you
love when
shouldn't
I
be
court
doing
appointed
any of
for
those things. And it's mandated, and there's research to show it, so put it in your reports.
Okay.
Susan's gonna help you with that.
Yeah.
I've got lots of it upstairs too that I
I'll
use
give
all the
everyone
time.
my card and I'll set up a,
I wish
You-
I
Can we
had
get a
this
list going for
when I was
email
trying.
addresses
Sure.
that you two can send us stuff to?
that's a great idea.
Okay.
It's It's not copyrighted.
Okay, thank you.
And there's one.
I like
reason
yours better
use
than
it.
I think this is, I think this.
I have one, but this one's better.
This little chart is perfect.
Yeah, this
Because,
chart right here,
You know,
this,
we have the cycle of violence.
Well, we have tons
before,
of these, but.
But
No,
it's
this
good
isn't
to
the
exact.
power, this is
the
after.
power.
This is the
This is after,
post-separation
yeah.
power. and
this is the
control.
post-separation one.
Post-separation.
Right, and we
We
do
always
this in
talk
a
about-
different format. I don't use a wheel.
Right.
Yeah, I use a checklist that
Right.
But
helps them.
one of the things
yeah.
about the wheel is people are used to that power and control wheel that we've
Mhm.
used for decades. Well, this is the power and control wheel specific to post-separation power and control. And the courts kind of like these kind of charts.
Right.
I mean,
It's
when I
straightforward.
testify in criminal court, we put up the power and control wheel chart.
It's easier to look at.
It is.
And there's
We love
there's really good
diagrams.
information on
Yes.
here to use. It's about harassment and intimidation
Oh.
specific to post-separation, okay? Things that you can cite, undermining her ability to parent. And this is written about male abusers because it's done by the project that works with male abusers. So if you have female abusers, this does not translate to that. Most of the research that we have is on male abusers because that's predominantly who does felony abuse. Okay, so when we use any information, you can't just extrapolate it to female abusers because it doesn't apply. Okay, so this is for male post-separation, male abusers post-separation. So we look at discrediting her as a mother. This happens in family court all the time. Withholding financial support.
Yep.
Okay, withdrawing child support. In California, visitations are not at all correlated with whether you pay child support
That's
or not.
right.
You can be 20 years behind in child support where your kid would be too old to.
And still get to
But you
see
can
your
be 2
kid.
years behind in child support and still get all your visitations and all of your stuff.
And
Now, I
you
grew up
better
in
not bring
Indiana.
it up, because if you do, that's what you're really here for.
Yeah,
Just here for the money.
You're just here for the money.
Right.
You're not here because you care about your child.
See, one of the worst things we did was pass that best interest of the child, calling it best interest of the child, because what that did was just open up everything to interpretation.
Right,
There is no standard
what does
now.
that mean?
There are other states that don't use that, and they're much better off.
Well, also too, family court's definition, juvenile court's definition, and the probate court's definition are all different.
you're right.
You're exactly
for best
right.
interest. So,
I have a case right now that if it was in the juvenile courts, she would have custody of her children back. She'd be seeing her children. It's been 18 months that she's been on supervised visits because the abuser keeps finding ways to keep the process slowed
Yeah,
down.
that's the
And she
institutional
loses
grooming.
everything in family court. And if she was in juvenile court, if she had had her children taken away for failure to protect, she'd already have her kids back.
or even the probate court.
Exactly, even that.
The
But
probate-
why do the judges allow for this type of court
Because they're
Part-
just,
chaos?
Part of what happened is it was a gradual process, okay? It was a gradual process, and when we changed things to the best interest of the child, and then we started doing things like saying, okay, in order to assess the best interest, we need to have psychologists and therapists come in and tell us what we should do. That's what opened the door to all of this abuse, and I'm sorry, it's my field, but I'm sorry, but that's the truth. You go back and look at the legal history of family courts, okay, and when they changed it to the best interest of the child, that changed how we assess cases. And that brought in all this crap with therapists evaluating things and the judges no longer looking at evidence. I'm telling you, if you're poor and have nothing and you just go to court and you use family court services one time, your outcome in a domestic violence or child sexual abuse case is better than if you have money and you hire all of us.
You're right.
Right.
Okay? Because
You can speak for
what
yourself.
happened was, years ago, they did the studies about that the children are better off if they have access to their fathers, and they did all those longitudinal studies on those groups of kids from Marin County.
Right.
Now, I'm sorry, I do not believe that kids from Marin County
Right.
are
I was raised in
representative
Marin County.
are representative of the entire country and children in family court, okay? But they did all these studies on these kids over a period of time of 14 years, I believe it was, and they wrote all these things that said the children were better off if they had access to their fathers. And that's what brought in then all this stuff about alienation and brought all this stuff in about parents coaching and brought all this stuff about people lying. We did this to ourselves. And until now, we've got to undo it. The problem is, it's not so much, there are some bad judges. But if I just say, I don't think it's the fault of the judges, it's what we've taught the judges. It's what we did to change the law. And as soon as we change the law, then it changed what judges do. family law judges aren't judges anymore.
They're commissioners, right?
You know, they just
Well,
do
they're-
what their
they're-
mediators or evaluators tell
Oh, I
them.
see what you're
Well, yeah,
saying,
and see
yeah.
what happens too is the judges don't know what to do. They're so overcrowded, so overbooked. So what they do is then they start saying, well, we want this expert, this expert, this expert. So maybe if all the experts give me something, then I have something to go on. And then you get that little
I've seen that
click.
you go full circle with that, and then they end up giving they dismiss everything, all the hard work you did, and then they want child counsel.
And one of the other pieces of the problem is
And
each
guess
one of the
what? We
counties,
become evaluators.
Yeah.
each one of the counties have their list of people who are
Yes.
who are with the court, and those people have been trained in alienation, and they've been
Right.
trained that people lie, they've been trained in the same stuff the judges are trained in, so what do? And they've got their cadre of therapists that they refer to who all believe the same thing.
Yeah.
So it becomes a vicious cycle.
You're right.
And again, until we get
Case
more
law.
good evaluators in there, and until we get appellate law to change it, this is how it is. This is what we're living
This is
with.
what
We
we're
can
starting.
bitch about it,
But
we
gotta
can not
do
like it, but until we get something to change it, this is what we live with. All we can do is keep doing the best job we can do.
I like your advice though of citing and having
Cite
scientific
things.
research to back up our theory of observation. I think all reports should be like that.
And the more you have that, the more
Well,
solid
the
your
more
report
credible
is.
you are.
You're right.
The more the judge is gonna go, okay.
You're right.
And the
So
other
you
thing,
can't complain.
the thing that happens though is you get some of the jaded evaluators and they go to journals. There's a journal, and I'll use his name and it's gonna be on tape, John Hamel. Okay?
Oh, yeah.
John
Ew.
Hamel has his own journal that he is the editor of,
Right.
and everybody who submits an article to it, I've read it when it first came out. You have to agree that women are more violent than men, and you have to agree to certain things or he won't publish your articles. So what they do now is they have 3 years now, this journal, and they cite each other all the time. So they have all kinds of citations and it makes it look like a good report. But if it's garbage in, garbage out. So you gotta look at what are the citations and where are they coming from.
Oh, well, I've challenged him that, and
Yeah.
we're not speaking to each other anymore.
Well,
But-
you know,
but, you know,
John and I have a love-hate relationship.
It's frustrating because
Yeah.
he thinks his research is the only research.
He does think
I'm
it's the only research.
and I see him every quarterly, because we're both on the same.
So that's why,
program, but-
back to my point
Yeah.
about if I could just have a list from somebody I trust, of,
Yeah.
you know,
Right.
Yeah, it's hard.
assessment.
Who do you
Right.
trust?
Actually,
Exactly, but what you wanna do is go
Research
to
peer reviewed.
Yeah.
before it
peer
gets-
reviewed
That's
journals
right,
that
you're
are
right. Peer
nationally,
reviewed only.
nationally
Right.
recognized
That's right, peer
journals.
reviewed only. And his
John
is
has
not,
peer reviews in his journal,
Yeah, from the
but
other
they're all
peers.
people who agree with them, you
Yeah,
know?
exactly.
You know, so you
This
gotta,
is
so somebody could come in and do a report that has all kinds of citations, but depending on who they've cited, those citations could be junk.
Right.
and I wanna look at their mean sample. I want it, like you said, you know, some of the studies that they had in Marin are not indicative of the whole United States.
Well, exactly, and that's what they based this whole best interest of the court on, was all those
Right,
studies,
okay.
so anyway, this is a really good chart. You can find ways to use it, it talks about disregarding what the children want, endangering the children, disrupting the woman's relationship with her children, these are all common abuser tactics
Mhm,
post-separation. And so if you're evaluating a case and you see all these things happening, document all these things.
Mhm.
Document behaviors. That's how you're gonna get where you wanna go. Document these behaviors.
I've gone as far as quoting what the kids say in terms of what the dad has been doing. And
That
then you
doesn't
get,
work in Sacramento.
and then you get backlash from, you already know what I'm gonna say. I mean, you're right, it's frustrating.
Yeah. We all know.
I put a thing in here, about some of the high-risk checklist of some of the most high-risk things, because everybody who does a child custody evaluation should be doing a danger assessment.
Oh, yeah.
A lethality.
And
Mhm.
it can be a lethality or a
Okay.
danger assessment, okay? There are several good ones out there. Interestingly enough, none of them are normed on women, so
Right.
don't use any kind of danger assessment or lethality assessment. Even though they do them on the women prisoners all the time, they use the SARA and they use the, what's the other one?
Oh, they have one inside CDC that's, like
It's-
also normed on men.
yeah,
but I
that's
can't
their own
remember what it's
deal.
called. Yeah.
They use those all the time, even though they've never been normed on women. And they say right in front they've never been normed, but then they use it for their assessment. You know, so if you're assessing a battered woman, you can use Jackie Campbell's danger assessment, which has had 25 or 30 years of research now. And it's free, you can go, all you gotta do is Google danger assessment, you can get it for free. If you, and you can get the scoring sheet because it's graded scoring, it's not just, some of them are weighted, so make sure you get the scoring sheet. If you want to know all the citations, you can get all the citations for its research. You can go to Jackie Campbell's website, who developed it. Everything on there is free, you can use it. It's in Spanish, it's in English, it's in
Fantastic.
several other different languages now. And they have one for lesbian couples now, I believe. They're same-sex couples, I'm not sure whether it's just lesbian or gay or lesbian. But if you go on and look at this stuff on the website, it's well-researched. If you put in danger assessments or lethality assessments in Google, they all come up. Some of them you have to pay to get them. You know, but if you're doing these kind of assessments, you need to have the right tools. If you don't have the right tools, if you're going to build a house and you don't have a hammer, then say, well, I'll pretend I'm building your house, but I won't get a hammer. Get the right tools that you need. If you got to pay for them, you got to pay for them. Okay. If you don't do one, you're unethical. And hopefully that's going to be something that
That's
will be
yeah,
appealed
because in
at
our,
some point.
well, in our charts, when PO comes to look at our charts, that all the danger assessment and lethality assessments have to be in there.
Right, but see,
So
that's
part
your
of-
county.
Mhm.
See, they don't do that in Sacramento County, and most counties they don't, I can tell you. So it's good that they do it there. But if you're doing an evaluation, make sure you do a danger assessment. But the high-risk checklist, you know, is recent separation or divorce. Obviously, we know separation is a time of highest lethality. You know, so when you're working a child custody case, most of the time they're going to be recently separated, or maybe they never lived together. They just have a child in common. Okay, but make sure you look at these things. Perceived infidelity. If somebody believes the other person cheated on them, that's high danger for abuse cases. Okay, victim has imminent fear of the partner. Jackie Campbell found that in her research, the #1 best predictor of lethality is the battered woman's belief that he's going to kill her. That predicted lethality more than any other test that we have. And she underestimates. So if a woman tells you, I believe he's going to kill me, you better do a danger assessment. Because that's your best predictor of lethality. And yet the courts don't believe it.
That's right.
Okay? But make sure you follow
You're
through.
right.
A threat to kill self or others. If they're in a high-risk family, I hate the word conflict. It's not a conflict, it's violence. But if they're in a higher intense family conflict, harassing or stalking. Stalking is highly correlated with lethality.
That's right.
We have stalking assessment tools. If you better have them in your arsenal. Okay, there are things that everybody should have in their toolbox. What do you use to assess stalking? Do you have anything? And if you don't, you better find something. And if you don't know what to use and whether it's a good one, go to a site that you trust, or go to someone you trust and say, what tools do you use for assessing stalking? Because they're out there. Okay. Escalation in severity, frequency, or intensity of abuse. We already know that. Strangled or attempt to strangle. There's an amazing amount of research coming out right now about strangulation. And strangulation is one of the highest lethality tools that you have. Strangulation and rape. There's some really good articles that have been done out of San Diego about strangulation. And it's exclusively men, by the way, who strangle. They studied over 300 cases in their study in San Diego, and there wasn't one woman. And part of it's because a woman's not strong enough to strangle a man. Now, they haven't done anything with same-sex couples, with lesbian couples, but they didn't have any.
There's
when there was
also a sexual
strangulation.
correlation with the strangling.
Strangulation seems to be exclusively male. Okay? And if the person doesn't die, there's still lots of other danger that happens. So get up to speed on strangulation, because it's very highly correlated with lethality. If you need studies, contact me. I've got access to some of the studies. I can tell you some of the ones to read. Okay? There's a good body of research out there now about strangulation and domestic violence. If you've got a victim, a person who's telling you in a court assessment that my abuser strangles me, or if the kids say, and they don't as often do it with the kids, but if they say there's strangulation, you need to look at this case right now as a high lethality case. And do all your due diligence as you're putting that case together. Okay, access or threatened use of weapons, we already know that. Then there's all this stuff, you know, about everybody having weapons and everybody having a right to weapons and all that sort of stuff. But what we know is when in a domestic violence case where there are weapons involved, it increases the lethality for women.
That's
and
what
children.
Though.
Every day. We just saw yesterday a guy We don't even know what's going on in this case. He was a grandfather who killed his daughter and 5 grandchildren, and then himself. No, 4 grandchildren and then himself. We don't know anything about that case yet. We don't know whether it's domestic violence, we don't know whether he's psychotic, we don't know anything. But we hear those cases every day. I always say, cut to the chase, just shoot yourself. Don't kill everybody else.
Well, there's a
on the way.
financial, cultural component to those murder, those.
There's all kinds of
Yeah.
complications to them. They're very, very complicated. Destruction of property in a relationship conflict is a high risk. Current injuries to the victim. I just did an assessment about 6 months ago on a woman who was charged with domestic violence. And when she came to me to do the assessment, and I took pictures of it, when she came to me to the assessment, she had 2 black eyes, her whole jaw was black, all the way down her neck, bruises all over her arms. The guy that she was charged with abusing had just beaten the shit out of her. Now he then got charged with domestic violence too, but they won't drop the charges against her, even though she has a long history of being
What
abused
county
by
is
this
this?
guy. She fought back and threw a perfume bottle at him, and it was considered assault with a deadly weapon. Now they dropped that, okay, but they wouldn't drop the charges against her, because nobody wants to be seen as gender biased, so they're going after the women. We prosecute women. Now there are women who commit domestic violence. It's mostly misdemeanor domestic violence.
That's right.
But there are women who commit domestic violence.
It's
And
such
I'm
a
not saying those
tiny
cases shouldn't be
percentage.
taken seriously. They should be taken seriously. But most of those women are also victims,
That's right.
okay?
All the
So-
girls that are in my class that are charged with domestic violence are actually victims.
Exactly. So, that happens most of the time. But, we've still got to do what we do. So look for current injuries. High levels of anger and hostility. Experience moderate to severe anxiety or depression. What we know is depression, if an abuser has depression, that's a higher risk for danger,
All right.
okay? Abuse of alcohol and other substances, which we know with all crimes. So if you see any of those things going on when you assess a case, that's a high risk and you should be doing a danger assessment. Okay, now, this next thing, do we need to take a break for people to take a break? We'd like to get something to eat, get something to
Yeah,
drink,
I'd like to
stretch?
go to ladies'
Let's
night.
let's take we're about halfway through, and I planned in here so we could take breaks. So why don't we take like a 10 or 15 minute stretch break? Is that okay with everybody? Okay, you go. Okay, so where were we? The next thing we were going to talk about, we're actually doing okay here on our agenda. Is there any of these things that I could talk about some more about? I gave you a handout from the Better Women's Justice Project. They do some incredible stuff. You really ought to get on their website because they have free webinars that they do all the time
Awesome.
with top people in the field who are doing incredible things, and they do wonderful, wonderful webinars. And like I say, you sign up for them and they're free. And you can also go on their website and see any webinar that they've ever done already. And so if you couldn't make the one that they had, you can go back and see ones they've already done. And so it's a really good site to have. I do not, this says it's copyrighted, so I probably need to contact them about everybody copying it and using it. I didn't do that ahead of time.
Which one, dear? The DV interview
The
guide?
domestic violence interview guide.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, it says it's copyrighted by them. So
I think if you cite it and you can use it
yeah, I
still.
think the only thing
That's
is
the, I think that's the clause, right? With just about anything they have on the
You can't
internet.
distribute it.
I'll contact them and find out, but I'm pretty sure that because they let everybody download it off their website.
Yeah, so I think there's, if I remember correctly, when I was doing my, my dissertation stuff, they said that as long, if you find something online, they're allowing you to disseminate it, but you have to cite it.
Yeah, and part of it is it's paid for with government funds, so most
It's
of those
probably,
are
yeah, you're
are
right.
public.
I think
are
you're
public
right.
domain then. So I put this in here because most people don't have any idea what to do with, thank you, whose clipboard?
Mine.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought that was yours, I
Okay,
apologize.
all right.
Sorry.
Most people, you find a case, you're doing a case, and they say there's domestic violence, and you don't get a case to evaluate unless there's something screwed up about it already. So it's either going to be domestic violence or child abuse
Right.
when you get a case, otherwise they'd have already figured it out. When you get a case that's domestic violence, most people don't know what to do. What do you do to assess it? How do I make sure I cover all the bases? What tools do I use? And the Better Women's Justice Project put together this interview guide that I thought was a pretty good one. And even if you don't use everything about it, I think it gives you a pretty good idea of some stuff to do, and it includes all the areas. So it's got some instructions at the beginning of it, you know, when you're talking about domestic violence, make sure you do this, and then it tells you how to use it. First column is looking for, you know, broad areas, and then the right column is refining that more. Okay, so they've gone through and they've looked at all these areas that are common to domestic violence cases, and they've tried to include all the different kinds of things. Now, you know, we know, I have one that I use all the time that I've added to over time, you know, because when we first got the list that I used, that was developed years ago, partially by Marianne Dutton, we didn't have GPS, we didn't have cell phones. And so I just attended a webinar about a month ago about the use of stalkers, how stalkers are using all these tools that we have now. And if you have someone who has fled and is in danger, the things that you need to do to make sure they can't be tracked with their phone and with their GPS systems and all the stuff that people have, that they don't even realize have locator finders on them.
Right.
I used to have an anti-theft thing on, I had a Toyota, there was an anti-theft thing on it, that I knew where that vehicle was all the time. All I had to do was go online and I knew where it was. Well, the purpose is so I could disable it if somebody stole it. And then I could also tell my insurance company exactly where it was, or the cops exactly where it was. Well, a friend of mine borrowed my car one time and went over to the Bay Area with her daughter. And so just for fun, I went on the thing to track and see where they were. And so I called her and I said, what are you guys doing? Oh, blah, 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 blah. I said, well, you're on such and such a highway. Geez, you're going 74 miles an hour. What's the speed limit? and I'm thinking as I'm doing that, what a cool tool for stalkers and batterers, because they can use all this stuff, and they do use all this technology. They absolutely use it to stalk and track their children and their wives. And you need to be very aware of that when you're doing an assessment, because you need to now ask those questions. Okay, you need to ask, does he check your cell phone history? Does he have a locator on there? Do you have a GPS on your car? Does he put spyware on your computer? And sometimes they don't know, but it's easy to put spyware on your computer.
They hack into their...
They can easily purchase,
Easily
very easily,
purchased.
things that they can then install in your car in a hidden location.
That's right.
And they can follow you around
Yep.
and track you
And,
with it.
and they can do the same thing with your computer. They can install it on your computer
They
without
can
you
hack
knowing
into
it.
your email.
And it's absolutely easy to get, so they read all your emails, you know, all that sort of stuff. If they're on your phone plan, some phone plans you can actually go on there and look at what every call somebody's made.
You
on
can read
call
their
history.
text.
You know, so these are all things that you need to be aware of. And if you're working with someone who's left their abuser, you need to make sure they're no longer on their phone.
That's right.
Their phone list,
Should
or
be
they'll
part
be
of the
able to
safety
track
plan.
that. They need to not have a locator on their phone. They need to turn that off. Every phone has it on there, and you can turn it off.
So your cars, your new cars, and you can't turn them off.
Yeah, some of them you can't turn them off.
Yeah.
Yeah. But there's some that you can block, and if you talk to the manufacturer, there's some of them you can block. So these are all things you need to be aware of if you're working with someone. And ask if these things are going on, because I'll bet you they are. Okay? So don't forget to ask about technology. Are they tracking the kids? One thing that abusers now are doing, I see all the time in court, is giving young kids a cell phone.
Right.
So they have access to the kid all the time, even though the mother says the kid couldn't have a phone, they're too young. The dad buys them a phone, and so they can talk to him all the time and keep track of their whereabouts. And if the mother goes to court and tries to complain about it, they accuse her
Of alienation.
of trying to alienate the child from the parent.
Right.
I've never once seen the courts take the phone away, not once. And it's happening more and more, so be aware of all these things. I mean, some of you are already aware of it all, but I just gotta talk about it. I just gotta say it, so that, and partly because it's also on film. Okay, so one of the things you wanna do is safety is always the number one thing. So when you do an interview with someone who says there's abuse, okay, you gotta make sure they're in a safe place to be answering your questions, and you wanna assess for safety. Okay, so you don't wanna do something that's gonna add to the problem. You do the interview separately for a reason. Now, part of the issue is that depending on what county you're in, the report that you write, that you say such and such said this, such and such said that, is available to the other side.
That's right.
So when you're saying things, when you write your report and you go, the mother is saying this, father's saying this, child's saying this, know perfectly well that the other side's going to have access to that. And it's unethical for you to change what you write But it is ethical for you to say to the person, please understand that this is not confidential.
Right.
This is not a confidential interview. Things that you say to me will be included in a report that will be available to all the parties.
Right.
Okay, make sure you always say that. Because people will tell you things. I have sort of as most of you do here at therapists, sort of an internal radar when somebody's about to tell me about child abuse, that's a client. I just feel it coming, and I always stop and go, wait a minute, okay? You haven't said anything yet, but before you do, let me just remind you, I'm a mandated reporter of child abuse. So if you tell me about that you suspect any child is being abused, I have to report it to the authorities. I can't keep that confidential. Now, I'm not saying don't tell me, I'm just saying I want you, if that's what you were about to say, I just want you to remember that. They always end up telling me anyway.
Right.
But it's important, you know, we need
Well,
to try to
ethically,
keep
we're supposed
people
to do that
safe.
anyway.
But it also creates a sense of trust that you're like looking out for their interests by
Exactly.
letting them know.
And you have to make sure that they know that you can't keep anything confidential. You're not, if you're the therapist, you can keep things confidential to a
Right.
point. Okay? But it's only to a point, by the way, that's
That's
kind of an illusion.
That's right.
If you're working with the courts in a capacity, you cannot keep things confidential. So they might think you're the therapist, but make sure they know you're not. And even if you're a therapist, it's really an illusion that you have confidentiality, because a judge can order you, especially in a child custody case, if the person's in therapy, a judge can order you to release your records. Now, you cannot do it and go to jail.
Well, there's certain codes that protect you. If you feel it's not in the best interest of the child, it can override it.
But a
but-
judge still has to make that
Yeah.
ruling, and so you still have to submit your stuff
But
in
then
camera.
but-
You still have to submit it in camera to the judge, so you don't ever believe that your records are 100% protected, that's my point.
But to get away from you being liable, you can be in court under oath and say, Your Honor, what I'm about ready to say is gonna throw one of these two under the bus, so unless you're ordering me to testify,
Yeah, I mean,
they have to,
I'm not even talking about,
then I'm not liable anymore.
I'm
And
not
it-
even talking about your liability, I'm
Yeah.
talking about the safety issue. I'm talking
Right,
about the
but
safety
there's a
issue.
liability issue too, so I
Yeah,
mean, that's
there
why,
is.
therapists don't talk. But if the judge orders you to, it's automatically off
Yeah,
your
it's
shoulders.
not on you, but it's
That's
still, there's
right.
still safety issues that you
That's
want to try to
right.
protect.
Question about that, because in a report that I just submitted, there was an 11-year-old girl who really wanted to talk to me. And we talked for a long, like an hour and a half, and I wrote everything down. And I really went back and forth about including that in my report, and I decided not to. And the judge ordered me to give her that, I mentioned it, that I had talked to her in the report.
You had to, because you were ordered to.
Right, but
You can't protect that because, and that's one of the things that's
Okay.
important to keep your role clear, because when that little girl's talking to you, she feels like she's talking to somebody who gets it and who trusts her, and so she's talking to you now as if you're a therapist,
right.
and you can't protect her. Once you're ordered to do an evaluation, you can't protect any of the information. So one of the things that's hard for us to do as therapists is to make sure we don't flip into a different role. And you can also get in trouble for that one. Make sure you don't flip into a different role. So you have to include it in your report. You can't not. And the judge was correct to tell you that. That was a correct ruling.
Okay.
But you just need to know that you can't keep it secret. You're not their therapist.
No,
so you can't
and I had
protect
talked to her about it. You understand who's gonna see the report, your mom, your
I know,
dad.
but then
the
you
judge.
got caring about her too much.
Yeah, I was like,
It's not that you can't care about people. You care about them, but you can't protect them in family court.
Right.
That's not your role. Your role was to do the evaluation. So anything you did was risk for the mill.
Okay.
You know, I had a problem with that too, where I was afraid of repercussions of the father if I disclosed what the kids were telling me. It's a catch-22.
It is a catch.
And so what I did is I wrote a letter to the judge saying there are very concerning things the children are telling me. I'm not willing to disclose them just now because I'm concerned about protecting these kids from the dad. If you're willing to let me submit, these things, then I want you to be aware that my concern is the safety of these children because of what they
Right.
disclosed.
And then the judge is making a ruling on it, which is what it should be.
Right, and then they ask me for the report,
course.
which exonerates you from both sides of being biased.
Right.
The judge actually asked you, and he's ready now to hear that there are some accusations from the children against the perpetrator, and it
some-
forces the judge to ask
And
you.
again, depending on what county and what judge.
Yeah, you're right, you're right.
you know. So there isn't any one size fits all, unfortunately, the family court. There's one size doesn't fit.
Because that can go against you too,
Yeah, they could rule against you, they can do
Yeah.
a lot of things. But know whatever you do in a family court thing, because you've been hired by the family court, basically, none of it is confidential, you have to disclose it all.
Right, that and the privilege revocations in the evidentiary code in California, basically anytime somebody's mental status is a part of a legal matter, they lose their privilege to keep that information out of the court.
Exactly.
Except, as I just learned quite recently, in federal court matters.
Yeah, federal court's very different.
Evidentiary things do not apply, and so I can go in immigration court and refuse to answer and not be in any trouble based on the protecting the confidentiality of
Mental
of
health.
the party. Right,
Yeah,
right, and.
yeah, federal
nobody
laws
can
are
force
very
me to.
different than state
Yeah.
laws.
It was
If
a
you-
way to find out that I had that ability.
Yeah, that's
to-
interesting,
Yeah.
that's good to know.
Yeah.
That is very good to know. Yeah, if you change venues, make sure you know the rules. You know, in California, if I testify in court, we don't use the term battered woman syndrome. The correct description is
Battered person.
intimate partner battering and its effects. Everywhere else in the world, it's intimate partner violence. In California, it's intimate partner battering. Okay, if you go to federal court, however, it's battered woman syndrome. They haven't changed it
Right.
from battered woman syndrome yet. If you go
Just
to
to
Oregon,
the DSM.
if you go to Oregon, it's battered woman syndrome and you have to prove it as a diagnosis.
Right,
Well, it's
You
a
know,
syndrome.
So every
so
state you work in is different, every venue you work
It's
in
a
is
syndrome,
different.
just like PSD.
Know the rules in your county. If you work in a different county, every county has their own rules, unfortunately, in California. So know what the rules are in the county that you're working in, know what the rules are in the state you're working in, know, and if you do federal case, know that that's different and learn the rules. So always know the rules. It seems kind of daunting sometimes, and what we do is not easy work, and that's why not everybody wants to do it.
right,
Look at how few people, of all the therapists out there.
You're right.
How few people do what we do.
right.
And the reason is because it's hard, and it's adversarial, and people try to
It's
make
dangerous.
you look like an ass, and they try to discredit you,
Yeah.
and they try to sue you.
Yep.
Now, they can't sue you for doing the report. The one thing they can sue you about is if you do something that's unethical to your license.
Right.
They can't, you're protected just the same way that lawyers and judges are protected unless you do something that's unethical to your license. And I will send everybody that disciplinary action that came down, because that's pretty important, and it's gonna hopefully change the way that we can get people to do reports and stop putting some of the junk science in.
Right.
Okay, so let's look at this interview guide. Okay. And I want to kind of go through this because these issues are important, and you know, some of this I know I'm preaching to the choir because you've already done this, but you know, so what you're doing is you're following, and you don't have to follow this exact guideline. They put this down to train people to do an interview following this exact thing. They train people how to interview battered women by doing this. Okay, so you start by talking about your current relationship with whoever the person is. Okay, and then they put the discussion areas: ability to express views, trust in the other person's judgment, reliance on the other person's word, cost of disagreement, and post-separation changes. Now, you don't just go down and ask them boom, 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 boom. Those are the guidelines for the things they want you to explore with the person. And then when you're writing your notes, you're writing notes on all those things. Okay, so you're making sure to include those. And then what the things to listen for are autonomy, control, balance of power, fear, danger, safety, and vulnerability. And if you hear those things, you check those boxes, and you try to get more information, and you scribble lots of notes. You're probably going to need another piece of paper to scribble lots of notes on. I try to put my notes right on in my interview sheets, because like I said, most of the work I do is in criminal court, and everything I do is going to get turned over to all the attorneys anyway. And so even though they can't read what I write, it's all on there, and I can say that I did it at the time of the interview. The person didn't fill it out, I did. Here are the notes that I took. Here's why this is in my report. You know, it's included in this section of what we talked about, and all that sort of thing. So you get it right on your sheet, but you can do it whatever way's comfortable. And then you ask about how comfortable are you interacting with this person now. Okay, so if you're in a child custody situation, let's say his name is Joe Blow. Okay, how comfortable are you interacting with Joe Blow now? So you want to find out what's going on there. You know, being alone together, meeting face to face, talking on the phone, emailing or texting, public encounters. What's comfortable for the person? Well, how do they feel safe? Okay, and you want to look at prior separations. And you do things that Lenore Walker sort of started this idea of, she didn't call it snapshots, but she called this idea of somebody can't recall every incident that occurred, And they usually think about physical abuse and they don't think about all the other things that we do bring up so that they talk about them. But she talked about they can't remember everything that happened, the order that happened, when it happened, like a cop wants you to. So let's do highlights. What was the first incident that ever happened? What was the most recent one? What was the worst one? Okay, and then you fill in from there. And actually Lenore started that with her interviews in the 1970s, and it's still a damn good way to do an interview. You get those snapshots, and here they call it snapshots, of what are some happy times, what are the most worrisome things, and what are the most scary ones. You know, you can use these, or you can use whatever ones that you've worked out. And other things, you know, you're listening for dependability, for dishonesty, disrespect, manipulation, coercion, intimidation, degrading and humiliation, sabotage, surveillance, all the things that we know are part of power and control and coercive control. Okay, so you're listening and looking for those things. That's how you document domestic violence. Because you're most often not going to have police reports. You're most often not going to have restraining orders. You're most often not going to have lots of witnesses except the kids, and nobody believes them. Okay? So you're going to have to do it through documentation of the areas that we know that correlate with intimate partner battering. Are all of these areas that we're looking about, like over here, that you're listening for. Okay? So the more you document those behaviors and those situations, the stronger your case is. The more thorough it is, the more the judge is going to say, you know, because they always want to say, well, you just find domestic violence in every case, don't you? You know, and so I don't do independent evaluations anymore. I just get brought into a domestic violence case to assess for domestic violence most of the time in family court. And so they'll say to me, well, don't you always find domestic violence? Don't you find domestic violence more than other people? And I said, well, doesn't a cardiologist find heart problems more than a GP? Because they're referred to the cardiologist because somebody already screened for heart problems. People referred to me, they don't just give me random people off the street and say, go assess these people, or I wouldn't find any more people than anyone else does. Somebody's pre-screened these. Why would somebody want to pay me if they haven't pre-screened it and they think there's a reason to think it's true?
Right.
So yes, do I find more domestic violence than other people do? Yes, indeed I do, way more. But it's because, like the cardiologist finds more heart problems. I'm not the GP, okay? I'm the specialist, okay? And that usually kind of calms them down. There was some appellate ruling where a district attorney wrote a brief for it that absolutely misquoted some of my testimony, and it's in that appellate case, and it gets thrown at me every once in a while, and it took something I said totally out of context about that issue. They took it like, I think 85% of the people in the world are victims of domestic violence, or 85% of everybody I know. Well, no, of the cases that get referred to me, you know, because they say, do you ever turn a case down and say it's not domestic violence? Yes, I do. Okay, there's some that aren't. But most are, because they've been pre-screened. And so when I said probably 85%, that's 85% of the cases that are pre-screened and sent to me.
Right, they left that part out.
Did
Yeah,
you
they
file a
left that little
declaration?
piece out,
Yeah.
and so it makes me look like an idiot.
Did you
So-
file a declaration correcting that? That's what I tried to do.
An attorney did.
Yeah, because
But I
I
don't
see
know
that
whether
too. I
they
get
changed it
people
or not,
misquoting what
but,
I've had in the report too, and it's like,
but
oh,
yeah,
great, now I have to file a declaration.
Things have been sent in, but whether they changed it on the record or not, I don't know. Okay, the other thing you look at is access to resources. What does the person have, what don't they have? And this gets into some of the financial abuse, some of the other kinds of things, if the resources are all controlled by one person. And you ask about those questions. Who decides how you spend money? Have there been changes to that? And then you're looking at things like blackmail, financial sabotage, prostitution. Because a lot of times, I work on a lot of cases where the guy's, she's not bringing in any money anymore, so he turns her out as a prostitute, and then he takes all her money and still beats her up. And then she gets arrested for prostitution, or gets thrown in for prostitution, and then he uses that later, to try to use that against her in some way. Most of those guys don't go for custody, however, because they don't care. But all of these things are important to look at, whether these things are happening. And then you talk about the children, okay? And you try to see whether, what's been happening. What are your concerns about your kids and their safety? Okay, and you listen for those kinds of things. What worries are the most? And then you're listening for all these things like post-separation violence, intimidation, trauma and terror, children treated like their property, lack of attunement to the kids, denial of the kids' feelings, boundary violations. When you have a case where where someone says, where the person says they're domestic violence, usually we'll use the case of the mom, says they're domestic violence, okay? He's trying to get custody of the kids, okay? He's never attended a parent-teacher conference. He doesn't know who the children's friends are. He doesn't know their favorite color. He doesn't know the shows they watch on TV. He doesn't know their favorite game. What do they like to do in their spare time? What's their best friend's name? Who's their dentist? When's the last time they went to the dentist? If you can't answer those kinds of questions, you're not involved with your child. And yet the family courts seem not to care. Well, we need to give them a
They don't.
chance.
Yeah.
We gotta give them a chance. Well, if you can document stuff, the more you can document, the stronger your case. And then if the judge goes against it, or you know, if somebody else is an evaluator who comes up with some hairball stuff, then you've got some grounds for, and hopefully that's a case that will get turned over on appeal, and then we get some appellate law about it, okay? But you want to do a thorough job when you think there's domestic violence. Okay, parenting time, how do they work with that? Has the person ever threatened to use the kids to manipulate or control you? You know, has the person ever said, if you ever leave me, you'll never see the children again?
Mhm.
Well, they tend to poo-poo that in the family courts because they think everybody's just mad and they say stuff because they're mad. When there's domestic violence, it's not about being mad,
You're
it's
right.
about control.
That's exactly right.
And it's part of a pattern.
Yep.
And unless you can show that it's a pattern, they don't care about the individual behaviors. So that's why you put it together as a pattern of behavior. I had a family law case that I worked on where the guy was with this woman and they had a 4-year-old child. He had abused her. She believed he was sexually abusing their child, okay? He had a history of his previous family of physically assaulting his sons, physically assaulting his wife, controlling them through money, being intimidating, doing all the kinds of things that we look at in coercive control with his prior family. And the judge ruled in the case that it was irrelevant because it was too long ago.
I
And
hear
my
that
point
all the
is,
time.
it's a pattern of behavior. Interestingly enough, in California, 3044 and it says 5 years, the previous 5 years. So in this case in California, you couldn't have brought it up because it was more than 5 years ago. Colorado doesn't have a distinction in years. You can bring anything up. This case was in Colorado. You can bring anything up from any time. But it shows a pattern of behavior, for God's sake. It's not like, oh, he abused this person, then he abused this person and their kids. But that was then, and now he's a whole new guy. This person's accused him of abuse, let's ignore that.
Well, the one thing that I had when I was an expert witness in a case that was similar to what you're talking about with the 5-year rule that they're looking for, otherwise they dismiss it, was I used the battered women syndrome defense in that situation because I was able to pull medical records from the mother of how many times she's been treated over the years, even though there would be 2-year intervals of no violence. And so I was able to prove a 10-year history. Plus he had a prior, you know, right in the beginning of their relationship, and she was fighting for custody and divorce 10 years later because she had had enough. Well, that's what his attorney tried to pull, was that, well,
But
there
you still
nothing's...
gotta show a pattern of behavior in the last 5 years.
Exactly, but we showed one incident in the last 5 years.
That's
And
all you need is one.
Nope, they were trying to not label it as domestic violence, and that was that Kincaid case I was telling you about.
Okay.
Yeah, and we won, actually, because we actually were able to show the court that while there may not have been what your perception is of a 5-year, you know, span of abuse is, here's the 10-year span with medical records to prove it. And so that's how we were able to
And
get
actually,
it.
if there was anything in the last 5 years, they would win that on appeal. Because you can show any pattern you want to show in California of any
She had
time
one,
prior to
yeah.
5 years, but if you can't show anything in that 5 years. Now, it doesn't have to be physical abuse. It can be coercion and control, but you gotta be able to document it. It could be financial abuse, it could be any kind of thing, but
And using the child
but
as a
what
weapon.
Family Code 44 is about, it mostly shows physical, sexual abuse.
You're right.
So if you can't show those two things in the last 5 years, the person would actually win that on appeal. And in California law, it's gotta be in the last 5 years for it to be relevant. And that was part of a compromise between somebody who opposed it and somebody who didn't, which is how we got the word battering in there
I
instead of
see.
violence.
Okay.
Everything, when you take a bill before the legislature, is all compromise. You know, it's like all the bills that California Protective Parents Association tries to get about child molestation almost always gets opposed by the Psychological Association, which is one of the interesting things. They oppose all of the child abuse bills because we're trying to hold them accountable for things, I think is what part of it is. They always oppose it, and there are a couple other father's rights groups obviously oppose it all the time. But it's surprising who opposes domestic violence and child custody and child abuse stuff is almost always psychological association. And they're pretty powerful. So they don't want some of the bills to pass.
Why?
They have different reasons for them, and a lot of them are because some of them are where we would take away the immunity of, like the one where we take away the immunity of child custody evaluators. They of course don't want that. They fought that and they won. But every bill gets watered down, so
I
that
know.
we tried to get parental alienation declared a term that you could not use in a custody evaluation, and they fought that. And they won. We have still not gotten in there. We got the word in there, the phrase in there of using, it wasn't junk science, but using theories that aren't scientifically
Scientific,
appropriate. But we couldn't use the word parental alienation because they fought it and we couldn't get it in the bill. And they still fight that. There are a whole bunch of terms they won't let us use that we need in there. But so know when bills go through, there's a reason why they have things.
Your mangled, mutilated
That's right.
catalog is left there, and you know who did it when you open the doors.
And then you call the cops, but you can't prove it. And then you go to family law, and the judge says, well, we don't know that he did that, you know, it's like,
Well, I actually won a case
Except for I don't know.
in terms of child custody, not legal custody, but, physical custody, where the dad took the kitten and threw it out of the child window and said, "You're next."
Right.
And the only way we were able to prove that is the child took a snapshot of the kitten.
Yeah, now they use cell phones to.
And we were,
to
if it
show
wasn't
their
for that, it
abuse.
would have been the child's word against the dad. I mean,
And there was a case years ago that, she used to be an advocate that did a lot of work, and actually, her daughter helped start the Family Violence Appellate Project.
Wow.
The daughter of the abuse helped start it, and she talks about it all the time. I won't say her name because I would ask for permission, but she talks very freely about it and as a public speaker. And when she was a kid, she was the oldest, and she had a younger brother and sister, and their father killed their dog, their cat, their potbelly pig, their parakeet, every animal they ever had, their dad killed. Throwing them out windows, throwing them against walls, twisting their necks, hitting them, doing whatever, killed every family pet they had. And when they got away from their father, of course they were supposed to still see him for visitations, but when they got away from their father, and they were living with their mother primarily, they all had pictures of pets on the wall, and they wouldn't get a pet because they were afraid someone would hurt it. And until those kids, I'll have to call her and ask her, I've got her email address. To this day, to my knowledge, those kids don't have pets because there was a condition that someone's gonna kill it. And one of the kids went to school one day and they were doing a thing about, show and tell about mommy and daddy, and this girl put 2 chocolate donuts around her eyes and they said, what are you doing? She said, I'm being my mommy. Her mom always had black eyes.
Oh.
Okay. This particular kid, she's a great kid. She's part of the Courageous Kids Network. She's 20. She's a lawyer now, so she's 25 years old, something like that. They had ordered child custody visitations with their dad in spite of his abuse, and she decided when she was 9 or 10 years old. I should know the exact age. When she was 9 or 10 years old, or 11 something, she decided she wasn't going to go. So she hot glue gunned herself to the couch. So when her dad came to pick her up, she said, I'm not going and you can't make me. So he called the cops. And the sheriffs came out there and she was glue gunned to the damn couch. She's glued to the couch. And so the cop made her dad go outside and came and talked to her. And she said, I'm not going. You can't make me go. I'm part of the couch. You cannot make me go. I'm not going with him. These are the reasons why I'm not going. He's abusive. He used to hit my mother. He used to hit us. He's still abusive. I'm not going with him anymore. And the cop decided, they don't usually do this, the cop decided that she was so adamant about not going that he decided she didn't have to go. And he actually went to court and testified
How
on
old was
behalf
she?
of her not having visitations with her father anymore. But her younger brother and sister still had to go.
I have cases like that too, where I have an older sibling who's a certain age and they're not forcing him to go, but the 2 younger ones have to go.
Yeah, when they get to be a certain age, they usually just kind of
Yeah.
let it go. Okay, but you look at destroyed property. How are we doing on time?
We have 25 minutes.
An hour.
We got an hour. We go to 2:30.
Oh.
We'll take another break between now and then too. Interferes with your social life, threatened things, destroyed your property, disabling cars, hurting your car, puncturing your tires. Again, nobody believes any one of those things. But if it's a piece in the puzzle, we're trying to get as many puzzle pieces as we can get. Because without all the pieces, we don't have a picture. Because if you just go, well, I know he punctured my tires, well, can you prove it? Well, no. And then you go into family court and go, well, he's disabling my car, he's pounding on my door, he's doing this. Well, they don't believe you. But if you have a whole big picture of things that you can present, it's one of many things, and they're liable to believe you. Okay?
Do you ever have your victims, this is what I normally do, it's also good therapy for them, or at least they've told me. I have them write down chronologically what they remember has happened to them, and they give me a narrative.
It's almost impossible for most of the people that I work with to do a narrative because they don't have one. Because the abuse that they experienced was so traumatizing that they have to learn to do a narrative. And even then, they don't have many of the pieces because of traumatic memory. They've lost a lot of the pieces.
I've
And that's
got
one, and
actually
I'm
a
going
lot
to
of
talk about
success
that in
with
just a minute, as a matter of fact, so that's a good lead in, we'll hold that. Because some people can do it, and they can do it over time, but they usually can't do it just right then or in
Well,
one
it depends
sitting.
on where you're at in your
And
case.
they certainly can't do it at the beginning of the process.
Right, you're right.
Or when the law enforcement comes. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute because I'm going to talk about forensic experiential interviews. Let me finish this and then we'll get to that. Look at immediate safety concerns, because part of what you have to assess for is dangerousness, and if there's any immediate safety, then that's important. And if you're interviewing the alleged abuser, okay, you're also interviewing for safety and dangerousness, and you know, if there's any kind of threat or anything like that that you have to do a tear-off warning on, you're responsible for doing that, so you have to keep all that in your head. The abusers usually come in and minimize everything, so I usually don't have to make a tear-off because they come in and say none of it ever happened. I'll tell you a funny story that I've shared with people before. I did an assessment for a case where this woman had been pretty badly abused, and because of the abuse, she agreed to a marital settlement agreement where she got almost nothing. But she did get the kids as part of the agreement, okay? And so he didn't have any visitations with the kids, he didn't have any relationship with the kids. And he filed when the boy was, I think, 7, he filed that he wanted to have visitations. So he filed this motion with the court to that point. So then she said, well, I want to have the marital settlement agreement thrown out because it was coerced. So her attorney hired me to do a domestic violence assessment, okay? Well, I did the assessment, and there was pretty horrible abuse in this case. And I did the assessment, and the marital settlement agreement was thrown out, and he had to give her half the assets and all that sort of stuff. Well, then he still wanted to have visitations with the kids. But he didn't have it yet. But she said, I know that he's done some stuff that's stalking, and I think he's violated the restraining order, because there's a restraining order against him having any contact with kids. And she said, I'm pretty certain that he's violated it, and here's the reasons why I think so. So I wrote this report, and she prevailed in the parts that she prevailed, and then there was a custody thing going on. And he told the custody evaluator about this report that I'd written, and of course he said it was all bullshit. And so the custody evaluator said, well, whatever. He said, well, I want her to interview me. She never talked to me, I want her to interview me.
Careful
And
what you
then
ask
whoever
for.
the evaluator was knew me and said, oh, we can do that. You can do that if you want to. I guess it was a judge who said, you really want to do that? He said, yeah. So he comes to see me, okay? And I'm talking to him, and I get along with guys pretty well because I've played lots of sports, and I just can hang out. Most guys get along with me pretty well. So, we're just kind of talking about things, and, he told me his version of all the things, and I said, so you really want to tell me that when she says you were holding her up by her throat against the door, that you never laid one hand on her? I didn't do that. I said, come on. This is me you're talking to here. Now you're going to tell me you didn't lay a hand on her. Well, I might have had my hand on her shoulder and she misunderstood. I said, and it slipped, I take it, from your shoulder to your neck to get all those bruises on it? Come on, that didn't happen by now. Well, I might have got my hand on her throat, but I didn't hold her up there. And so what they do is they eventually sort of tell me their story.
Mm-hmm.
So then he starts talking to me, and this is information I didn't have. He starts talking to me about the boy. And I said, well, how old is he now? And he told me how old he was. And I said, well, tell me a little bit about why you want to have a relationship with him. And then he starts telling me something about where the boy goes to school, which he's not supposed to know. And I said, well, and he started telling me some other stuff that I know he's not supposed to know. And I said, well, how did you find all this stuff out? You're pretty good at this. How did you find all this out? Well, I hired a private investigator. Oh, really? Yeah, I know where they live. I know where he goes to school. And he's like bragging to me.
That's what they do, that
I
they
know where
hire.
he goes to
Yeah,
school, and I went down there and I saw where the school was, and I had pictures of him from the private investigator, and I had a bag of candy, and I went to the fence at the school, and when I saw him, I offered him some candy, and he came over and I gave him a piece of candy. And so I didn't make any big gestures, I didn't do anything, I wasn't acting like I was all friggin' excited, although inside I was jumping up and down. Nothing, he told me all this, he laid it all out like it was just a wonderful thing, showed how much he cared about his kid, okay? And then he left, and then I wrote my report about how he would, broke the restraining order and did this and did that, and all the things that he
Are
admitted
you allowed to
to.
disclose that, though? Does he sign a release for that?
Oh, it was a release for the court.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah, because-
Jackpot.
Yeah, oh, no, none of it was confidential. So I wrote everything he told me, all the stuff he told me about the abuse that he admitted to, and all this stuff, and put it in a report. And I submitted the report, and about 3 days later, he calls me. And I answered the phone, and I called him back. He said, how could you have written all those things about me? And I said, well,
You told me.
you told me every one of those things. I said, think about it. You told me this, didn't you? Well, yeah. And then when you were talking about that, you told me that? Well, yeah. And then I said, I didn't put anything in there you didn't tell me. And so, needless to say, he did not get to see his kids, and he got popped for violation of the restraining order, and we prevailed in that case, but we mostly prevailed because a lot of it was in criminal court instead of family court. But anyway, I mean, you can find out stuff even talking to perpetrators. Not always, but you can. Because a lot of times I think it's okay what they did. So this last page on page 10 has got some risk assessment factors on there. Make sure you check for all those things about the perpetrator. And you ask about immediate economic concerns, parenting concerns, and long-term concerns that the person has. Again, all of these things, if you do all of those things, you're going to get a really good picture of what's going on. Okay? Any questions about that? Okay. Do we need to take another break before we do the last part?
I'm fine.
It's up to you.
Let's go, I'm still good for a few more minutes. Are you good? Did you want to take a break? If anybody wants to take a break, we all take a break. So, do you want to take a break?
Well, we're going till 2:30?
Yeah.
Okay. We'll go a few more minutes, I guess.
Because in order to get 4 hours, we have to account for break time.
Okay.
So that's why we don't do it from 10 to 2, we do it from 10 to 2:30.
Oh, okay.
So that incorporates breaks. Otherwise, they don't allow us to use 4 hours. Okay?
Oh, is this for some people getting CEUs
Yeah.
for this?
Yes.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, that's the reason for the CEUs.
Okay, that's what I was wondering. I'm like,
Sorry, the 4-hour CEUs has to be
okay,
actual 4
you
hours
got
of
it. I
teaching.
understand.
They're very strict about it, too.
Yep.
Okay. Forensic experiential trauma interview. I had never heard this referred to this way before, and I'm the queen of webinars. I find webinars all over that are free, that I probably do 2 webinars a week. There's some great webinars that are out there. This is how to do a forensic experiential trauma interview, and it really is basically about how to do a trauma-informed interview, because everybody talks about, is this program trauma-informed or is this trauma-informed? That's our new buzzword, that and evidence-based, it's like, yeah, right, everybody throws that around like they mean something, it doesn't. But they do. To do a forensic interview that's trauma-informed is very different than the way a cop does an interview. And so the contrast is doing a trauma interview versus the way a cop does an interview. And it's based on understanding how the brain works. Okay, if you understand how the brain works, you do an interview for trauma very differently than you do other kinds of interviews. And that's why we were talking about doing the timeline. Almost all survivors cannot do that. And some of them can't even do it years afterward. They can put pieces in, and they can put this, that, or the other. They can fill in a lot of the blanks, but some of those blanks are lost. When I testify in court, I talk about all the experiences of trauma that someone has, and it's usually battered women I'm talking about, can be a rape victim too. That if you think about the memory as being like a file cabinet, okay? Non-traumatic stuff, I have this file cabinet and I have all these folders in it, and the folder has all the papers in it, and it's all nice and neat. And if I'm looking for something, I just go to that folder and I pull it up and the stuff I want is in there, and then when I'm done, I put it right back so I can always find it in that same spot. Well, the way traumatic memory works is, imagine I took that same file drawer, and I always use the courthouse as an example. I'm leaving the courthouse, and as I get to the edge of the courthouse, I drop my file cabinet, and it's raining out, the wind's blowing, and papers go flying everywhere. You know, some of it blows off in the wind, it gets stepped on, stuff is going on, people want to come help me, so we just shove stuff back in that file cabinet. It just gets shoved in there. Some of the stuff blows away, we never find it. Some of it gets torn in half. You know, somebody's dog grabbed some of it, somebody took some of it and put it in a trash can. But what I've got here is a big mess. So now when I go back and try to find something, it's not where I think it is and I can't find it, okay? So if I try to put something in order, it's not in order anymore. Things aren't where I thought they would be. Some of the stuff is lost forever. Some of it's in the wrong place. Some of it's in a space where 5 years from now, if I happen to pull up that folder, there's that stuff in there I was thinking about before, there it finally is, now I found it. And now maybe I can put it someplace else. But that's the way traumatic memory works. Okay, so when we ask somebody in a police interview, okay, tell me everything that happened, tell me what they did, what time it was, what color they were
Tell me
wearing.
the exact
What
dates.
this, the exact, what
Yeah,
did
I
you do
love
then? Why did you fight back? Did you yell? Did you do this? The person doesn't have a clue for most of that stuff. They can't answer any of it. First of all, most of the research says 38%, but in my experience, it's about 50% of people who are in traumatic, women who are in traumatic situations go into what we call tonic immobility,
Yes.
which is that freeze thing. And when you're in that, you don't process information. Your cerebral cortex is not working. Your prefrontal lobes are not working. You're not processing or storing information, and there's no memory trace that's laid down.
Right.
And the stuff that you do focus on is sensory. Or you may see one thing that you focus on because it's danger, like if there's a knife. You see that knife, you know everything about that knife, but you can't tell you anything about the hand holding it or the person holding it.
Right.
Okay? So what happens is we get a flood of sensory information. Sensory stuff stays with us. Okay, but because your amygdala is hijacking the rest of your brain, you don't process that information. It's like that file cabinet that dropped. So when you ask someone, like a cop does, let's put it all in order, tell me this, tell me that, tell me this, tell me that, blah, 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 like a little battering ram going at them, they can't give them the information because, one, they don't have it yet. Now, if you leave them be for 48 hours and not ask them anything about it, a lot of that stuff can process through. Because a lot of it is there, but it's just not filed where they can find it. Some of it's not there, but a lot of it is there, they just can't find it. If you allow them to calm down, their amygdala to stop firing, okay, then sometimes they can come up with some of that information later. We know that with cop shootings. If you wait and talk to them 48 hours afterward, and they do this with law enforcement officers, they wait about 48 hours to interview them. They can give you a lot more of the information than if they talk to them right away because of all the effective trauma. So what happens is a police officer arrives at the scene where there's a domestic violence situation, and what they do is fire all these questions at them. And then if they take them downtown, they fire all these questions at them. And someone did a study and showed that during the time that they were doing that, the cop never once let the woman finish a sentence.
Right.
Not one. Not one sentence was finished, let alone explain anything. Okay, so when you do a forensic experiential trauma interview, you do it very, very differently. You understand trauma. You understand that mostly what you're going to have is sensory stuff. So you operate from there. You ask questions about, what did you smell? What did you feel? What did you taste? What did you hear? You ask sensory questions. And then you ask things related to that. Like, was there something irritating? If they talk about something rubbing on their skin, there might have been, you talk about that because that's a sensory thing. You go through the sensory information and you flesh that out. From that, you may later be able to get more of the cognitive information that you can find, that the person can find. But if you don't deal with the sensory, that's where they are. They're stuck in their senses.
You're exactly right. In fact, one of my first cases, I was an intern. It's probably the most shocking case. It's still with me today because it's 10 years later. I'm sure some of you who live in Contra Costa County have heard of this case. it was around the same time the Tracy Dugard case came out, so we didn't get the publicity and the notoriety as much as we should have, but it's still in litigation that's gonna come out eventually, where the mother and the father raped and sodomized all 6 of their girls. Well, when I first got this case, the oldest child who took care of all the youngest ones she came to me for behavioral problems. And she was telling me her nightmares. And so when I decided to do what you're talking about, I changed the interviewing process into, well, you know, what was in your room at that time? And do you remember, you know, sure enough, she remembered the alarm clock. For some reason, it kept sticking in her head with this dream. And so she told me what day it was and what time it was. And then she associated the color of the neon lights of the clock with the, and that's what triggered her to remember that he had sodomized her because she was on her period. And she said, I remember because it was my 13th birthday. And he was really mad at me because it was, and she only remembered that it was because of the whole alarm clock thing.
Right.
You know, so at any rate, then we realized she wasn't having a dream, she was having flashbacks.
Yeah, the flashback.
And it was a
Yeah.
completely different thing. And that's how we got her to go to the police. The police was able to talk to the youngest one, which everyone else was past the statute of limitations. And he got 300 years. I mean, it took us
Good.
7 years, but we did it.
Yeah, there's often something like that that doesn't seem to make sense to anybody else, that will be sort of a triggering thing. I do a lot of work with survivors in therapy, and I specialize in treating trauma. You know, and when you're doing a lot of the work that you're doing, you find the sensory stuff, and then you build ways to treat that, where what you do is you change it you create a motion picture of it, and then you change it to impact so that they're not stuck in the traumatic memory over and over and over, because they're playing it over and over and over like
Right.
it's a loop, stuck in a loop, and that's one of the ways you get them out of it. Anyway, I gotta get back to what we're supposed to talk about here. The best interview priorities to the person who is on the receiving end is they feel like they're being listened to. Cops don't listen to you. I watch police interviews, at least 2 a week, a case I'm working on. They never listen. They interrupt. They love to hear themselves talk.
Oh, they do.
Jesus, such inane friggin' chatter, you know? And then they leave them in the room for hours at a time, you know, and it's always cold in there for some reason. But most of the stuff they do is just talking at the person. They're not listening. There's nothing about it that's related to trauma.
Yeah, that's true.
What you're gonna tell them, because if you're talking about stuff that's scary, and even if you're just talking about the sensory parts of it, if you feel like the person listening to it can't handle what you're talking about, you clam up.
Right.
And many therapists don't know that they can't tolerate it, and a person starts to tell them about stuff, and they never finish telling it because they know their therapist can't handle it. So they never talk about their trauma. They're sent to trauma therapy and they never talk about their trauma because the therapist can't deal with it. It takes little sensory cues, and people can tell that you are not okay with it.
It's the
And that happens with
metacommunication.
attorneys.
Attorneys
Even more.
especially.
So I'm
Yeah.
doing lots of free in-services with law firms where I come in and talk about secondary traumatization, how to tap and do other things so you can stay present. You know, what do you do to take care of yourself? Because if your client can't tell you, you can't put it in their declaration and you can't litigate it.
And that's exactly right, Susan, because one of the things that we know is that when the person's trying to put all this stuff together, people worry about if you ask them about the trauma, it's re-traumatizing to them. It's not
No, it's not.
re-traumatizing to them, it's traumatizing to you to hear
That's
it.
right.
Right.
So it's more likely
Right.
the listener's gonna be traumatized by telling it than the teller. So attorneys hear this stuff and they get flipped out, even criminal attorneys who hear it all the time. I tell them stuff and they say, well, the client never told me that, and their client never told me that. I said, no, they're never going to.
Because they weren't approachable.
Okay, first of all, you don't know how to ask for it, and second of all, you don't know how to listen for it, and third of all, you know, you'd be so flipped out by it that they would know that you don't know, that you're out of your context, so they would stop telling you. They tell me all kinds of things they're not gonna tell you. That's why you hired me.
Right.
You know, this is my job. I don't know how to present the law, although sometimes I think I get it better than some of the attorneys I see.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm not a lawyer. I didn't go to law school, you know, so I don't know how to present all the law stuff. I don't know how to write the briefs. I don't know how to do that stuff. But I know how to do what I do.
Right.
Okay, you do what you do, I'll do what I do, and as long as we can interface with each other, we're good. I'll teach you how to interface with me. But you're not doing the interview because you don't know what you do.
I wish you could talk to some of the CIC interviewers because they act just like
Oh
the
yeah,
cops.
they're
They're horrible.
just like cops.
They are.
And unfortunately, then that's the first exposure that a
Yes,
child
and then you
has
can't get them to
to
talk.
doing an interview, and
That's
then you
right.
can't get them to talk after
You're
that.
right.
And then when you get them to talk, it's because they're sitting in some court-ordered person
Mhm.
that they don't want to talk to.
You're right.
The other part is whether the listener can understand you, whether they can, whether they have the capacity to hear the trauma. Those are the things that people talk about. Does the person know what I'm telling them? Do they get trauma? Because if you don't get trauma, don't talk to people about
That's
trauma,
right.
because you're gonna screw it up. People unlock memory by focusing on sight, smell, thoughts, feeling, impact. People can talk about the impact something had on them, trying to understand their experiences. So you talk to them about their flashbacks, you talk to them about their terror, things they felt, like whether they felt nauseous. A lot of times there's a smell that someone associates, especially children with child sexual abuse. There's a smell that the abuser had every time they came in. It might have been whiskey, it might be some sort of aftershave, it might be something else, but it's frequently associated with a smell. And every time they hear that smell, they get sick.
Yep.
And sometimes they don't know why. They just get that smell and they start barfing and they have no idea why. And you know, working with them, you can help unlock some of those memories. I mean, we got to be careful not to put in false memories, which is in some ways easier and harder to do than people think. It's different than most people think. But what you are as a listener, you ask questions. You don't insert information, you ask questions. Now when I do a domestic violence interview, I ask about things like pushing, shoving, you know, I ask for certain information because I know the things to ask for that can unlock some of their memories. And in a way it's leading, and I admit that it's leading, but it's also a way to get through the interview and unlock some of the stuff. But mostly what you want to focus on is the senses. And that's not what the cops go for. The cops go for behaviors. The cops want what happened. One of the interesting things that's true about this is that we develop neural pathways in our brain. I call them brain grooves. That every behavior you do has a neurochemical pathway that it follows in your brain. And the more you do it, the stronger that neurological pathway becomes. So repetition causes neurological pathways. It's like if you've ever ridden a bike, you can for the rest of your life ride a bike unless you get MS. I found out that's an exception. That's one of the...
It's messing with your pathways.
What's
It
that?
messes with your pathways.
It does. It messes with
Like
it.
the
It interferes
bulldozer
with it.
comes
It puts a
through and the
little,
path is going.
it puts it in there and just sends it somewhere else.
Right.
But it's why people, even people with amnesia, know how to brush their teeth, know how to take a shower, know how to cook, know how to drive a car, because those things are brain grooves. But it's repetition of behavior that gives us brain grooves. Unless you have MS, you don't think about walking, unless there's something in your way or it's ice. You just walk. Okay, you don't think about every step that you take. Okay, you don't think about everything. It's just part of a neurological pathway that's well burned. Trauma, one experience of trauma burns a pathway, a neurological pathway in. It doesn't take repetition, it burns it in right now. And that's why it's so powerful. Okay, because it burns in that neurological pathway because of the intensity of the trauma, it burns it in after one time. Okay, so it doesn't take all the other stuff that everything else does. Most of you probably know about stuff about the hippocampus and all that. You probably had training about that. The other important thing for us to know is that ongoing exposure to trauma does sensitize the amygdala. Okay, so that it becomes hypersensitized to secreting cortisols and adrenaline. So if you've had multiple traumas, so when we go back to that ACE thing we were talking about, the more of those you've had, the more highly sensitized your amygdala is. And unfortunately, what we also know now, I mean it's fortunate we know it, unfortunate it happens, is if a child experiences multiple traumas, it actually changes the formation of the brain. There are neurological pathways that are never formed. Okay, there are sensitized areas that are sensitized to danger, but that doesn't allow other parts of the brain that would develop for concentration and attention and attachment. It doesn't allow those areas of the brain to develop. So we see many children who have multiple victimizations unable to attach to people. Wonderful people might try to adopt them, even when they're like 4 or 5 years old. And they can never attach to those people. They always have attachment issues. They never can bond with people. But that part of their brain did not get to develop because of the trauma. All these kids that we have, that we diagnose ADD, ADHD,
It's all misdiagnosed.
probably 50% of them
Yep,
or more are trauma
right.
survivors.
There's a
And their attention is not primary to ADHD, it's primary to trauma.
Trauma,
But that doesn't, in a way it doesn't matter. The etiology is different, but the effect is the same. But if you don't treat those kids for trauma, if you don't treat them as a trauma survivor, then they're never gonna get better.
Right, you're right.
If we just throw drugs at them and treat them like they're an ADHD kid, and that's just too bad, their brain's wired that way, then the underlying issue never gets dealt with.
There's a film, I'm sure you've seen it, it's called First Impressions.
Yes.
Yeah, and that explains all, I mean, if you're gonna, you know, I give it to my DB clients all the time so they understand what DB does to a child's developing brain. But they summarize all that for you. in
Yeah,
that
they do a
little
good
film.
job with that.
They
There are a
really
lot,
do.
there are a lot of tools out there. I was actually gonna play it today. There was a short film that I was gonna play for you that, but you can get lots of stuff on the internet. Have you guys ever heard of Jackson, what's his last name? God damn it. He's a guy that does a lot of talk to guys about domestic violence. He did a TED Talk. Do you guys ever look at TED Talks?
Oh, yeah.
I love TED Talks.
Oh, me
He did a
too.
TED Talk that's a wonderful thing about the only way we're gonna change domestic violence is when men start teaching other men to
Yeah,
not be violent. That men have to teach boys that it's not okay to be violent. Men have to teach other men that it's not okay to be violent. Because when we talked about before, about when guys group together and all that sort of stuff, and that increases the mentality for violence. If we do the opposite thing, it works. But it has to be men talking about it. We've had women talking about domestic violence for 35 years. And we've lowered the homicide rates in this country because we have domestic violence since we put in domestic violence shelters. We've lowered the homicide rate of women, of men. We haven't lowered the homicide rate of women very much. Better women's shelters help women not to kill their abusers. Fewer women kill their abusers every year. It's gone down. But the numbers of men who kill the women stayed the same pretty much through all those years. Now, the federal government is trying to tell us that domestic violence has gone down. It hasn't gone down any place I know about or anybody I know about, so I don't know where they're getting their numbers. But domestic violence homicides still occur out there. I mean, it's still happening. And we read about it every day, we hear about it every day. So, I don't remember what I was saying about that. I just sidetracked myself. Okay, so anyway, we were talking about narrative. One of the problems is if where you are is in trauma mode, your brain does not form a narrative of your experience. You have the sensory flood, but you have no narrative. And that's one of the reasons why people get PTSD, is they keep re-experiencing, re-flooding the stuff with all of the sensory stuff, but they don't have a narrative to move it out here and make sense. They did a study at Harvard many years ago of World War II veterans, and the ones who had PTSD and the ones who didn't. And the ones and all of them had experienced this one certain battle during World War II. They'd all experienced seeing people killed and maimed and all that sort of stuff. The guys who did not have PTSD had changed the story over time about the narrative of what happened. Some of the main events were still there, but the narrative had changed, okay? The guys who had PTSD were stuck in the same place. And it's because they were stuck in the sensory stuff without a good narrative. So when we ask people in the height of trauma to give us a narrative, they cannot do it.
yeah, I asked them to do it after.
Right, many
Yeah,
people
and
can't
it's-
even do it in court because
Yeah.
they get re-traumatized in court.
Right.
They see their abuser. Many people can never really do it very well. One of our jobs as treatment people is to help them create a narrative.
That's right, and it's good too if they're
Okay.
doing their impact statement or they need to testify. And preparing, what I do with my patients is I help them over time get used to the narrative so that when they
Right.
are ready to tell their story, you know, it's not in the context of fear. It's in the context of this is
This is
what
what happened.
this is what happened.
The important thing to know is that the people who are stuck there and can't get out of the sensory stuff are never going to get better.
Yeah.
And I work a lot with Vietnam vets because that's the era when I grew up. My brother was in Vietnam. I mean, I was in the military myself right after Vietnam, so everybody I worked with was a Vietnam vet. And I've done a lot of work since then working with Vietnam vets, and they're stuck in something. And it's where they're stuck is in the sensory piece of it. The smell of flesh burning, the sounds of the crackling of that stupid Agent Orange being, defoliation being put out there, the sounds of a helicopter. All those kind of things are stuck in the sensory pieces and they can't get a narrative to put with it. And until they can, they stay stuck. And what's interesting, as long as you're not working with somebody that's in a court case, it doesn't even matter if the narrative is true.
You're right.
It only matters that they get a narrative.
That's exactly right.
So, because there are all these blanks, and our psyche is not comfortable with blanks.
No.
And this is one of the important things about domestic violence cases. And like if you look at Janae Rice, this is one of the things, like think about her in this context, is this stuff happens and you don't have a narrative for it, and the narrative you do have, even when you get it, has gaps. Now, who is the person that you're around in domestic violence to help you fill in the gaps?
The perpetrator.
Your abuser.
Yeah.
Because you're usually isolated, there's nobody around, you don't have a lot of support, you don't talk to people about domestic violence. Okay, so who's the person that's going to fill in your narrative? Is your abuser. And they're going to fill in your narrative with stuff that makes
With their
you to
perception.
blame,
Mhm.
makes them not to blame. So why do women not leave? And if you look at this from a neuroscience standpoint, it makes sense. Because if your narrative is, I'm to blame, it's my fault, I love him, he didn't mean it, it was a misunderstanding. If that's your narrative, it makes sense why you stay.
Mhm. Or had I just,
Or makes
Or maybe,
sense
yeah.
why you didn't, why you're in minimizing and denying.
Yeah, mhm.
There's a neurological reason why we're in that space,
right.
okay? It fits with our brain chemistry. So instead of vilifying this woman, like a lot of people are doing on there, see her as a trauma survivor. She's doing the best she can do with what she's got, and we have exposed her to the entire world, and she's never going to be okay with that. We have ruined some piece of this woman's life that she can never restore by what we've done. We have re-victimized her every time that's shown on TV, every time somebody talks about her on TV like they know her. And we do this to victims all the time, and police officers do it all the time by getting mad because they can't give you the where, what, who, and when. That's not the way the brain works. The brain doesn't work that way. Now maybe she can get some of the who, what, when, where, how if you give her some time. And maybe not, because there are pieces that are usually always gone. You want to fill in the blanks, you'll make up stuff that makes sense. When I work with people in trial, there are pieces they don't remember, but then they start telling what happened there because they're uncomfortable with the gaps. So they fill it in with stuff they learn from other people,
Or
that
they
they read in the
overheard.
newspaper, that their attorney says, that they hear in court. Oh, well, that would make sense to put in there. And that becomes their narrative, not necessarily because it's true. And then everybody gets mad at them because they change your story. We're asking somebody to do something that's neurologically impossible to do, which is give you who, what, when, where, how, at the point when they're traumatized. So they'll tell you their story now, okay? And it's just like that file cabinet, okay? When I go to get stuff, I might be able to remember what happened in this place, and this place, and this place. But then the next time I go there, I might remember fact A, fact C, and fact Q. And then the next time, I may remember this and this and this, because there's a randomness to the way traumatic memory works. It's not in order the way regular memory is. Have you ever, you've tried to think of something and you can't think of it? And then later when you're not doing anything, all of a sudden it pops in your head? Well, that's sort of what happens with traumatic memory. Something you hadn't thought about or you've forgotten ever happened just suddenly pops in your head. Maybe when you're doing something else. Maybe looking at that piece of cheese triggered something. Okay? Maybe the dog bark triggered something that you haven't remembered for a long time. Oh my God, I remember when I was a kid. And Dad would come home and the dog would start to bark and we knew that this shit was going to hit the fan.
Or a song will trigger a memory.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Lots of things can happen that trigger that memory, but it's almost never going to be who, what, when, where, how.
I do a lot of testimony about why did this woman not tell the immigration officer in Texas what happened to her when he was male, had a uniform on, where uniforms in her country mean somebody's going to rape you.
Right?
And then was interviewed by a series of men who have no knowledge whatsoever, you know, in the cop style.
Right.
And then now it's 2 years later and they're finally getting around to, after writing a declaration, adding some more details. And why is that? Why is this person changing their...
Yeah, they got to be lying or changing their story.
Right, because they have to be lying. So my usual retort to the cross-examining attorney is, do you remember the exact date you learned to ride a bicycle? Because everybody who can ride a bicycle, they don't remember the exact date, and that's a happy memory,
Yeah.
right? It's even in the orderly file drawer, but you're not sure which folder or which drawer even that one's in.
Yeah.
And so just an idea of how memory works. Plus people who are, besides the amygdala flooding the brain, we also have the hippocampus, which is supposed to help manage and
Sorts it all out and manages it,
And
that's the
that
file
would-
cabinet.
People who have all kinds of chronic and repetitive trauma, the dendrites in their hippocampus start to shrink up and wither. And we have all this like neurological research that shows that those dendrites don't grow back.
Right,
Even if somebody gets a lot of treatment, they develop a narrative and they can function pretty well, they still, their way their memory consolidates and they lay down tracks of memory has completely irrevocably changed because of the effect of the trauma on the hippocampus.
Well,
exactly.
too, don't forget, the way we remember anything, the way the brain works is you're not remembering the exact memory, you're remembering the last time you remembered it.
Exactly.
That's how
Yeah,
it
you
works.
remember the image of remembering it, right.
Right.
And the other thing that's interesting, and we all know this, I know you all know this, but what's interesting about trauma and the way it works is that our brain processes what we imagine the same way that it processes what really happened.
Right.
So if we imagine that something happened over and over and over, this is what I talk to rape survivors about, is if you have flashes of that rape that you practice over, you rehearse over and over and over, there's a part of your brain that now thinks you've been raped 500 times, so why wouldn't you be scared to go out of your house? Why
Right.
wouldn't you be afraid to go to work? Why wouldn't you be afraid to go to that bar?
Right.
Because 500 times you've been raped. Okay, now let's put a new movie in, and let's have you rehearse the new movie. And because your brain doesn't know the difference between that and reality either.
And that's where
So let's
narratives
put in
come
a
in
new movie.
sometimes.
And that's how you start to make some changes. I did want to go through the last page of this thing, which is as part of this process is that victims aren't treated like they're witnesses to their own crime, and that's what cops do. Is they treat them like a witness to their crime instead of a survivor of the crime. Okay, so they hammer them for information that they don't have, like they're a witness.
And the
Um,
fear of being hammered is one of the reasons why people don't disclose.
That's right.
Exactly.
You're right.
Yeah, so there's all this stuff on the last page about the process to do that most of you already know. But you're really looking for context. You're asking them. You're not re-traumatizing them. It's not therapy though. You need to remember it's not therapy. It's therapeutic, but it's not therapy because you're not giving them direction and you're not telling them how to deal with their feelings. All you're doing is basically you're being a witness to their disclosure. And it's very difficult for therapists not to want to help them. I do these interviews with women who've been so horribly abused and they don't know the first goddamn thing to stop having flashbacks. They don't know how to stop the re-experiencing. I have all those skills, and when I'm in this context, I'm not allowed to give them that. Okay, because that would be a dual relationship. I know how to help people with flashbacks. I know how to do that, and it hurts me to leave somebody with something that I know I could help. That's the one part of my job that bothers the hell out of me. The one thing I do at the end of the interview, because it's brought up all this stuff, it's dredged up all this stuff. People usually really dread talking to me, but then they feel really good talking to me afterward, and they feel really good because they got to talk about it. Plus, I'm just fun to talk to because I can find humor in anything, and we do all sorts of fun stuff too. But at the end, I know they're going to keep thinking about it. And so even though I'm not their therapist and I'm not here to treat them, I do feel like I have a professional responsibility to help them with what I just did to them. Because what I just did to them is I brought all this stuff up.
That's
Okay.
the ethical thing
I
to
just
do.
highlighted all this stuff in
Yeah.
their amygdala. So what I do is I give them some simple little skills so they don't keep dwelling on it. And so I do that. I find out what do they have, like usually it's in a jail. What do you have in your cell? Do you play cards? Do you read? A lot of people read the Bible. Do you go to AA? Do you do whatever? And I find out that, and I say, do those things that are distracting. And then I teach them a simple little skill for distraction, which is, do you like music? Yeah, okay. Just pick any random letter of the alphabet, let's say P, and think of 5 songs that start with the letter P. Okay? Do you like TV? Okay, pick any random letter of the alphabet and pick 5 TV shows that start with the letter S. And it takes a little effort to do that, and what it does is it gets you out of that track of focusing on that. It's just a distraction technique, and it's kind of fun, and it works. So that's one thing I can do, because I don't want to leave them, I don't want to have left them all opened up and not have them figure out a way to close it back down again. Because you can't process that stuff in a prison or a jail cell. There is no way you can. You have to just shut it down. Because you're way too vulnerable. You're way too vulnerable to do that. And women in prison, they're going to be there forever, some of them. So they have to learn all kinds of skills for how to dissociate which in real life is not a real healthy thing to